I'll have the red one. 1, 2.
Bonjour. Donc du coup, vous êtes combien sur...
Oui, bah c'est ça.
Vous êtes combien sur le plateau là?
Sur le plateau, en tout, on est 5. Ouais. Et on attend la dernière ancienne qui va arriver.
au pire, je peux déjà vous faire le tour. Mais en gros, grosso modo, vous avez chacun un micro. Je peux la faire.
Intervenez, ils sont assez dissipés là. N'hésitez pas à prendre les devants parce que...
Bonjour.
Je répète, pour les autres.
Du coup, pour les micros... Donc voilà, si vous pouvez juste essayer de bien parler dedans, parce que si vous parlez comme ça, effectivement, on ne va pas vous entendre. Je sais que c'est... Mais voilà. Si vous pouvez, voilà, la technique du menton. Après, moi là-haut, moi, je peux vous rattraper, mais après, plus j'essaie de vous rattraper, plus ça crée du bruit et moins bien les gens vous entendent. Donc voilà, vraiment, si vous pouvez parler comme ça, c'est magnifique. Hop, du coup, vous avez chacun un micro.
Excusez-moi, si vous pouvez laisser les chaises en place, parce qu'il y a une captation vidéo. Ah ouais, mais du coup, moi, je vois pas mes speakers. Vous pouvez arrondir. Sinon, on va vous voir de profil, si ça les voit. C'est passé. Ok. Après, il a un très beau profil. Même que je vois mes gens, moi.
Est-ce que chacun peut faire un petit...
1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. Test, test. Check, check.
Essaye.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour tout le monde. On va être un tout petit peu en retard.
Good morning. We're going to start a bit late, unfortunately. So we're going to be slightly late.
On va être nickel.
On comptait sur les Allemands pour être...
Right. All set here. Bonjour tout le monde.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. We have a problem with one of the microphones. So once again, good morning. Welcome to this lovely place for the first session of the day. I think that everyone is familiar with the instructions given by the organization for this program. This roundtable is going to be in English. So I'm going to switch to English to introduce myself after this French-speaking welcome.
I'm the moderator for this session, which will be about a key topic in the framework of the French presidency of the European Union. We will talk about money. More specifically, we'll talk about public money, public funding. I don't know to what extent the audience is aware about how it works at European level, the idea of the European budget, the European funding framework. I hope some of you are familiar with it. If not, don't worry, we'll really touch base on all these subjects and explain to you how it works. The idea today, with our great experts on the subject will be to tackle how it works from the point of view of the cultural and creative sectors and also the news media sector. What are the key recent updates on the matter of European public funding? What new things in this framework did the French presidency of the EU bring to the table? And of course, what is the future going to bring in this particular subject of European funding for culture? So, this is a very, very short overview of what we're going to talk about. We have about, I think, 1 hour and 10 minutes to cover all these topics. It's a wide scope, so we'll try to be as thorough as possible. We'll have questions at the end. We'll try to keep 15-minute, 20-minute window at the end of the session. So please write down your questions as we go along, and at the end we'll open the floor to the audience. You can ask your questions in French, obviously, because we have spontaneous interpretation, which gives me the opportunity to thank our colleagues in the booth and also everybody in the production team to deliver this wonderful session of today. Okay, no further ado. I've been speaking too much already. Let's have our esteemed guests introduce themselves, maybe. What do you think? Should we start? Who wants to start first? I'm going to pick someone randomly. I'm going to start with Mathieu.
I don't mind. Thank you, Fabien. Thank you very much for having us today. So I'm Mathieu Philibert with Impala. It's the European Association of Independent Music Companies. So we represent close to 6,000 labels across Europe, basically music SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises. We're based in Brussels, and we're basically the voice of independence on all matters, EU matters, so EU funding, copyright, competition, all the topics that impact independent labels in one way or another.
Thank you, Mathieu. Should we go next with Barbara, maybe?
Why not? Good morning. Sorry for the slight delay. My name is Barbara Gessler. I'm the head of unit Creative Europe Culture Program at the European Commission in the Directorate General that's responsible for education, culture, youth and sport. And as Creative Europe is the only European program dedicated at supporting the cultural and creative sector, I'm here in this capacity to talk about, in particular, also funding and access to funding for the cultural and creative industries, and most importantly, because we have a very broad notion of what we define as cultural and creative sector, including also industries. Yes, and more later.
We're going to need a quick pause to check Barbara's microphone. Is it okay? It should be okay. Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you very much. Justina, your turn.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Justina Kurczabinska, and I work for the European Broadcasting Union, which is the association of public service radio and TV organizations in Europe. I think it's important to know almost the size of it because it reaches over 1 billion audiences and in 160 languages. And I think the languages is the key for broadening the heritage and the culture. I myself, I'm currently working on the news strategy and development. And I've been always associated with news. Before I was running the exchange that celebrated 60 years of exchanges between public service media. One of our members is, of course, France Télévisions. Of course, our members have been involved in many EU-funded projects. And since last year, in the area of news, we have launched a big news project, which is called the European Perspective, and I'll give you a little bit more detail about it later on. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Justina. Welcome to Paris. Last but not least, Arthur.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot for having me here. My name is Arthur Lagarde. I'm director at KA European Affairs, which is a consultancy and research center based in Brussels, and we are specialized in culture and creative industries. And what we do in relation to that is the whole chain from, let's say, research and policy design to engineering support programs for the cultural and creative industries, but also supporting individual organizations, companies on their financing strategies. So we cover the whole chain, let's say, from policy to actual funding. In a nutshell, that's what we do. And perhaps something important to mention is also that we were doing the capacity building of a Creative Europe guarantee facility. So basically training banks to help them invest in culture and creative industries. But I'll tell you more about this later.
Yeah, that's going to be a key subject because we talk about funding, we talk about public money. This also includes, obviously, access to private funding, support of the Commission or public institutions, and we'll cover that point specifically. So we have here with us experts, Brussels-based or Geneva-based, but really in close contact, permanent contact with our subject today, lobbying, policy making, research. So we'll have a broad range of perspectives, obviously also for you to ask your questions at the end and maybe have a chat at the end of the panel if you're more interested in what our speakers do. My first question for you guys is, because we're coming off, hopefully coming off, especially, you know, when it comes to the cultural and creative industries, it's been a rough couple of years. So we're coming off, hopefully, this rough couple of years. You hail from, Mathieu, the music industry, Justina, the news media industry. Obviously, Arthur and Barbara, you have a more bird's eye view on things because you cover so many other cultural and creative sectors in your work. But according to you, like, what are the biggest challenges facing either your respective sectors or the sectors that you're representing today, or more generally the cultural and creative sectors in Europe specifically? Not only France, not only, but really the European scale. What are the key challenges? We'll start with this and then we'll see how to support those with funding. So who'd like to give it a first shot? The usual suspects.
Is this working? Yeah. So as you said, COVID had obviously a huge impact on the cultural sector to varying degrees, depending where you sit in the industry, in the different sectors. But now that we're in the recovery phase, hopefully we're out of this for good, but we'll see. From the perspective of independent music companies, I think there are a few challenges. One of them is how to grow in a very concentrated market. Because obviously, I don't know if you are aware in the audience, but the recorded music sector is made up of thousands of small players, and then you have three, what we call major players, so the big companies, and there's a huge gap in between. So the question is, today, how can you grow to move from a smaller to a mid-sized player? Basically, how do you grow your business in today's world? And it's also a very fast-changing environment. I mean, obviously, in the music sector, we have new business models, new uses, new ways of producing music that come up all the time. So these are some of the main challenges. I would add probably also cutting through the noise. So there's never been more music available than today. So you're basically competing with all the music that exists. How do you make yourself heard? There's a very low barrier to entry. It's very easy to have your music out there, but how do you make yourself discovered? I think that's one of the big question marks today. And the last one, if I may, is transitioning to a carbon neutral sector. I think it's it's a challenge we all face, and we're playing our part. So we can come back to that.
Right. So level playing field, discoverability, and obviously the carbon challenges. That's for the independent music labels perspective. Maybe we'll continue with more sectorial view with you, Justina. So you represent more the news media industry or sector. So in the last couple of years, let's say, what's your impression? Like, what are the biggest challenges?
So I think that, first of all, the last 2 years has been, I think, we thought that there were huge challenges with the big tech and with, fragmentation of the audiences. But I think the last 2 years have been a real roller coaster for many media organizations. And that, of course, has been brought by the COVID, which has its huge challenges to the organizations, but also I think it speeded up development in many organizations. And of course, soon after, practically, we went into the war in Ukraine. And I'll talk a little bit about public service media, but I think very broadly, and I would like to quote, I attended 2 very interesting conferences, Media Forum in Bonn last week and Constructive Journalism Conference. And I would like to quote Maria Ressa, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and she emphasized that we are really at a very, very important point in time where we really have to focus and fight for independent media. Because in illiberal growing democracies, the facts are becoming debatable. And when the facts are becoming debatable, the society doesn't have a framework within which it operates. And it's very hard to make, societal decisions. So I think this is something very important, and it is a very critical time. And as the co-winner of the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize winner, Mr. Muratov said, unfortunately, now Putin won the war with independent media. So these are very strong signals, and equally you might have heard one more kind of strong signal why we have to look at news media was also the report of Reporters Without Borders, which is the index of the Press Freedom Index, and it was a 20th edition, and it was one of the most dramatic editions where 28 countries had very, very bad situation in the world media situation. So obviously these are very important signals because it's not only about the condition of the news media, but it's about what happens to the society and to the democratic processes in the societies. Until now, of course, public service media was seen as in a way, as well positioned because a certain income was guaranteed through the license fee or other measures. But increasingly public service media are also, or the existence of public service media is being questioned, and not only in the European Union, or you might have heard, but it was exactly, I think, 3 years ago, in Switzerland, which has very, established democratic system, there was a referendum on the existence of public service media. If the vote was negative, public service media would have been removed from the constitution of the Swiss Federation. What happened during that process, and I think it was a very, very amazing exercise. Luckily, we still have the Swiss services because Swiss public service, because the population voted largely yes. But what it showed was also dependencies of other media or private media who of course cooperate and generate this cooperation together. Public service media altogether invests about 18 billion euros in producing content, and of course it cooperates with other industries, and just in news we invest 5.5 billion. So to finish on a more positive side, as I said, I have attended, it was a 4th Global Constructive Journalism Conference. And I think that there is also, kind of light in the tunnel because all these changes are showing that they force people to innovate, and they show that we can approach journalism differently. And there are a lot of, interesting initiatives and a lot of interesting startups. And I think that we should also use these critical moments to move the innovation. But obviously, we can have great ideas, but having a little bit of money and being able to innovate helps these organizations. But it is a very important moment in time for the media and for the news media.
For sure. Yeah, thank you very much for that very thorough overview, and obviously many challenges in the landscape. Let's go back to the cultural and creative sectors for a while. So obviously we have Barbara here who supervises, let's say, the program that is the key that the program that you described, Creative Europe, a key program for our sectors in Europe, and the only one, you underlined it in your presentation, the only one that targets specifically culture, right? So from your perspective in the policy-making side of things, Barbara, in the last couple of years, biggest challenges?
Well, not surprisingly, those that were mentioned earlier as well. And a couple of you were also instrumental when we discussed the new program. The new program we still talk about the new program already for a year and a half. We have Creative Europe that's now running from 2021 to 2027. For us, it's still new, but that's also mainly due, of course, because we've gone through the COVID crisis and we've seen each other so little that we still feel, we're celebrating a new step. But indeed, it was a new step because already in this program generation, Creative Europe has already introduced the notion of news media freedom, support to journalism as a very important element before COVID, and in particular also before the consequences that you just mentioned of the Russian invasion in Ukraine and the attacks that we see now every day on independent media. And of course, this is scaling up the challenges that we are seeing, and we will talk about potential solutions and possibilities to react later. But of course, our framework remains a little bit limited. Creative Europe is a program, is 2.5 billion for 7 years. It sounds great, but it's for more than 40 countries and counting. So in reality, this money remains little. And I can say more about the political importance that is attached to media freedom and access to free media later on. But of course, for us, I think at the European level, and is also lined out by the member states in their latest conclusions, one of the most important issues, and that's also the principle of the Creative Europe program, is to safeguard and promote cultural diversity. And that is very much linked, of course, to what Mathieu just said. Discoverability remains a big issue. The global market, as the name has it, encompasses the whole world. And Europe has as a mandate, and so has our program, the obligation to make sure we support our European creative sectors. And in that same vein, obviously, one of the key issues we're working on, you also said it, inclusion is for us really one of the major challenges. We've seen how digital technology has been able to improve participation in culture, in particular when it comes to audiences, for example, audience development, big time, as you said as well. But this is something that we definitely need to work on, and it's obviously a priority for the Commission as a whole. And the other key cross-cutting priorities where we are aligning ourselves with all the policy areas across the European policy making is obviously reducing our carbon footprint, ecological concerns, keeping environmental changes abreast and also supporting the cultural and creative sectors to undergo this ecological transition period. All of this is what we want to support via Creative Europe, and that we're also working on politically with the new work plan for culture that is currently in preparation and which sets the frame for the cooperation at European level over the next years.
Yeah, that's going to be a subject for our next panel. Thank you, Barbara. So we see there are so many cross-cutting and new layers of priorities for the European Commission to support the cultural and creative sectors in those unprecedented times. I mean, in your experience, Barbara, like the sector has never been, you know, looking everywhere and seeing so many of these challenges and obstacles and difficulties. So it's very important that you know, at policy-making level, there's a good framework of support. And we'll finish this first round of questions with Arthur. So you, as a consultant specialized in understanding the European cultural and creators fabric, let's say, you have this sort of bird's eye view on things. A couple of sectors maybe that we haven't talked about, you know, like the audiovisual sectors, maybe you have some hints on like the key elements that they've been spotting as like major challenges, and then we'll move to the funding part of things.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Fabien. And well, picking up on this fabric idea, I think one of the things I would mention here is that it's very much interlinked. So when you look at the value chains of the cultural and creative sectors, there is such a strong the production, creation, distribution phase, they are all strongly intertwined. I'm saying this because in a post-COVID situation, what we see is bottlenecks at distribution level, which then sort of spills over to all, let's say, parts of the value chain. This matters because if you look at this fabric again, it's made up of many micro companies, micro associations. During COVID, most of the most precarious ones were the hardest hit. And what it means today is that if we want to address all of the challenges that these micro companies, these freelancers are facing, what we need to do is to have a bit of a supply shock kind of thing, where new things are relaunched and then it spills over to all those that were sort of out of jobs or with very precarious conditions. I'm saying all this because there is also, if we do all that, there is also an issue in two dimensions. One of them is liquidity and cash flow. That's going to be one of the major challenges looking forward for the cultural and creative sectors. The second one is bottlenecks at distribution levels. Most of the cultural and creative sectors, and if we talk about the audiovisual sector, cinema have limited spaces to air productions. Same for TVs. You can't, well, even with catch-up and let's say online portals, you still have limited space, let's say, for new productions. So this new cycle, there will be some bottlenecks a bit everywhere. We see that also a lot in theaters, in performing arts in general, where production have resumed. There is a limited space for new things to be shown. That's one very important thing. Now, if we look a bit at a sort of panoramic view of the cultural and creative sectors, I think we see very uneven distribution of, let's say, digital uptake and, let's say, post-COVID recovery. So if you look at video games, for instance, they've sort of spiked during COVID times and they're still growing very fiercely. So that's not all cultural and creative sectors are struggling. So what we need also today is to have very careful analysis of where support is needed. We need to think about this very carefully because, well, money is not, let's say, it's scarce. We have new ways of financing culture as well. So we need to look at different models as well, depending on what the situation is exactly, and cater to the needs of various cultural and creative sectors. And one of the things I'd like to add, beyond the challenges that were listed that are all very relevant, is also the social dimension of culture. That's also something very important to mention. I said micro-associations which are struggling, and they play a very important role in the social fabric of our territories. And that's something we need to look at quite carefully when it comes to access to funding as well, because many of those organizations may disappear in the short to medium term if we don't look at that very carefully. And I'm saying carefully because if we look at macroeconomic data, we might miss them because they are sort of, because other sectors are doing well, because some companies are doing better. So we might miss the fact that some associations are struggling a lot, and that plays a huge impact on the social fabric as well. Just one thing I'd like to add.
Sure, Justina, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to add,
shortly, because then let's move on to the presidency conclusions after this, but sure.
I just wanted to add one more element that we haven't mentioned because we talked about digital financial challenges, but I think something which is coming very strongly is the fact that, you know, on one hand, journalism is a vocation, but it's also became almost a dangerous job, even in the well-established democracies. So EBU has launched the campaign, Our Safety, Our Journalists, and the journalists are not threatened only in covering the war in Ukraine or being in Russia, but also in their own countries. So we had, for example, in Germany or in Holland, we had situations where journalists had to remove the identification from their microphones or the cars of the organizations they work for. And this is a real, signal of how difficult the situation is, and how challenging it is to do this job today.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for this very precise point. Also on the risks that our journalist colleagues are taking every day, especially on the battlefront. And this is yet another element that we are going to explore now. So the European Union supports culture and the news media. We heard Barbara, mostly through the Creative Europe program, also through other programs, such as the European Union's research program called Horizon Europe, also the education program and professional training program called Erasmus+, and obviously also, and Barbara mentioned it, through policy cooperation at member state level and the council work plan. One of the tools that is very important to harmonize, so to say, political positions when it comes to how to support culture at Brussels level, at EU level, is the presidency conclusions. So for those of you who are not familiar with how the EU works, I'm not going to start from scratch because we would need about 4 days of this session. But I will say the following. There are 3 institutions, major institutions. The European Commission, Barbara represents the European Commission, runs the programs. So it's the executive branch, defines who gets the funding, distributes the funding, selects the projects that are funded, right? And then you have the Council and the European Parliament. Those are, let's say, the legislative branches of the European Union. They vote on everything that the Commission will put on the table, put forward, suggest. They amend and they accept or they refuse, right? That's basically their biggest power. The Council is the 27 member states. The Parliament is your representatives who are elected by your vote, right? And they have 1 seat in Strasbourg and 1 seat in Brussels. It's really complicated. Anyways, the Council, so the member states, France and the 26 other member states of the European Union, They also have another role, which is to give impulsions to policy, which to drive the agenda that the other institutions will have to work on in the future. And every 6 months, there's a new member state that presides over the council, that basically gives its drive to the agenda of the European Union. And over the past 6 months, it was France. France was, let's say, in the driving seat of the car that is the European Union. And as such, France spurred a set of conclusions, which are political orientations, right? Guidelines for future work of the European Union. And some of those guidelines, they were about how to better support financially and with public funding, cultural and creative sectors. So all the challenges that we've identified now in the first part of this discussion, the presidency, French presidency, they worked with all the 26 other member states, and they basically asked themselves the question, how do we contribute to solving those challenges? How do we build a toolbox that will help cultural sectors, creative industries, the news media sector better face those unprecedented challenges, right? And those conclusions, I identified, maybe our speakers have identified more, but I've identified 3 key points. The first point is about accessibility. Some of you in the room may have tried before to apply for European funding, to apply for a call for proposals by the European Commission, submit an application, and go for a project. It's difficult to access this funding. So the member states, I see a few smiles like, yeah, yes it is. Well, the presidency, the French presidency decided, okay, let's do a conclusion saying we have to improve accessibility. And I think Arthur has interesting things to say about this. Another element that is key is access to finance, so to private funding, notably through equity, right? And I think Mathieu has interesting things to say about that. I think, maybe not, doesn't matter. He will have to. And another thing, another very important element that the presidency highlighted in its conclusions to better support cultural and creative industries is facilitate schemes, programs, funding tools to help export our culture and our creative industries throughout the world, which obviously is one of the key challenges also that COVID brought, right? The problem of the circulation of our works and our artists and professionals. So, sorry for taking this long to set the stage, but it's quite a complicated matter. So now that we have like a stage, let's have our actors get on it. Maybe I'll start with Arthur here about accessibility. So you obviously, how many applications for funding did you put through the pipeline in your life?
Oh, in my life? Yeah. Oh, whoa.
At European, huh? Not national.
Yeah, probably around 30, I would say.
30, right. And
yeah.
so you consider yourself an expert? I consider you an expert.
I know how it works, I would say.
Right.
And I've been through that.
And how do you think the EU, and this is one of the key things that the conclusions say, how do you think the EU can do like to make it easier to access that funding?
Yeah, that's a very tough question, in fact. Let's say that there are a couple of things. The first one is information. First, to be aware that the opportunity is out there. Because there are many things that, of course, there is Creative Europe, but there are also many more opportunities. People are not necessarily aware of them. So initially, we did a pilot thing, which was to create a sort of info portal for audiovisual and news media funding opportunities at EU level. And the idea was to do that based on the users. So to look at your needs, what you needed funding for, what kind of project you wanted to develop, and based on that, to give you all the relevant opportunities for you. And then DG EAC, so Barbara's DG,
Directorate
General,
right.
sorry, took that to the next level and did that for all cultural and creative sectors. So that's one thing, which is having the right information at the right time. That's the first thing. It's basic, but you need that first. Then there is a question of capacity, knowing your way around how to develop the right types of projects. Here, well, I'm not going to do a full coaching session, and in fact there are some institutions as well in France which can do that. I met some colleagues from Relais Culture Europe who are doing a great job at this, for example. So you can have also support from organizations that can help you to build that capacity. But there are a few principles to understand. So the EU added value, why your project is relevant to do at EU level. Why shouldn't you go to national level funding? Why should you do that with partners across Europe? Why is this a collaborative project? That's one very crucial thing to think about. That's the first thing. Then, in terms of accessibility, I would say that there are also opportunities to sort of get in the right mindset and get a foothold, let's say, on EU funding. And that would be working with existing projects that do some sort of cascade fundings. That's also one way of getting sort of, let's say, a first cooperation, first network also with partners. So, and these kind of cascade funding, so basically a project which finances smaller projects, is a way also to sort of start your EU funding career, let's say. Right. So those would be the basic things I would say here.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for that, sort of overarching view framework on how to make it more accessible, which is a key issue here. We're really talking about small programs. That's what Barbara was explaining. So it's very important that people can have access to it. Another conclusion, another article of the conclusions is about these new ways to support culture beyond strictly public support, so strictly grants or subsidies, right? This is a key trend in the last few years at European level. And here we're talking about, financial guarantees or equity systems. I'd like to hear your take on this, maybe Mathieu. You come from an industry, the music industry, where this is a subject, right?
Yeah. Well, for the loan guarantees and equity, so basically the loan guarantees is something at EU level that started with the previous program. There's been a very successful instrument managed by the European Investment Fund. We were very eager to see it come to fruition. I think the jury is still out whether labels have been able to benefit as much as we would have liked them to. It's partly down to... Is this working? It's partly down to labels. I'll try this one. Does it work better?
Two down.
It's partly a question of getting the information out there that those instruments are available. So it's part of our job really to promote the existence of these instruments to our members, to let them know. In France you have a similar system, I think it was used as an example, which is managed by IFSIC. So basically the fact that banks guarantee the loans, so it helps provide loans to smaller actors in the cultural sector who don't necessarily get easy access to those types of traditional loans from their banks. And then, as you mentioned, Fabien, now the EU, and maybe Barbara will say a few words about this, is also looking at the equity side. I have to say that that may be more interesting for some of our bigger members. So even in the independent world, you have some big companies who have an international presence and want to grow to become much bigger. And their equity might be an option that they look at. For the smaller players, not so much. And equity does imply, to a certain extent, losing part of your independence. So some of them might be a bit worried of that. Yeah. But it's not just for us, so it's really a much broader question.
It's a trend, yeah.
And if I may just very quickly on on the strategy, that's something that we very much welcome. Impala has been calling for a comprehensive strategy for the culture and creative industries for some years now, and we're really happy and commend the French presidency for taking the lead on this.
Yeah, the sort of streamlining towards all the programs, yeah. Thanks a lot, Mathieu. Justina, Barbara, what's your take on these issues of accessibility and the evolution of the tools to support creative industries?
As Mathieu, and we're sharing our microphone now. It's a nice symbol of cooperation. We have indeed, and Fabien, you mentioned them. We have a lot of instruments now, and that's also a big change compared to, say, 10 years ago, when Creative Europe was first came into being in 2014. We were kind of on our own. Now we have other programs that are not run by our Directorate General. And by the way, we run this program together with a DG that is responsible for, in particular, it's called DG Connect, everything linked to the internet and connectivity. This is also the part that is responsible for the media strategies and also for the whole support to the audiovisual industry. So we're a program run by 2 DGs, but that also already shows how synergies work, because we have a program which is called Digital Europe. You mentioned Horizon. We have now, since last week, in the framework of our support to the European Institute of Technology, a new specifically based instrument for the creative and cultural industries run by a consortium just selected last week, that is really specifically focusing on the needs of how to bring together these needs of the cultural sector with new technology and research. So I think the key word, and Mathieu said it as well, we have started this loan facility over the last program, but now this is part of a bigger program which is called Invest EU and has a specific chapter dedicated to the cultural and creative industries. So actually we've come a long way, but nonetheless, I think now really synergies are what we are looking for. We've discussed it a lot in the past years. What does it actually mean? For me, this means that we look at support to our sector that is dear to our hearts here today from various angles and try to bring the support to the sectors with different perspectives, but with the same aim, which is helping it grow, helping it recover, helping it become more resilient, helping it become more ecological, remain independent, and all these things that we mentioned earlier. I think another element that we very closely need to look into is how we increase, and you mentioned it also in your introduction, how we increase a better possibility of public-private funding also. We have a couple of projects in Creative Europe that do look a lot also at sponsoring, at philanthropy and those issues. I know this is maybe less systemic, but certainly something that I would like to see develop further, where we can look at a few successful attempts already from which others can learn. And as you all said very rightly, and thanks Arthur for saying it, because normally this is my thing, the European added value, obviously, will be always funding at the European level what is less well funded at other levels, meaning local, regional, or national level. But of course, in my dream fantasy, we would work in a common framework. We would work on a common strategy where those elements fit together and go in the same direction. Because overall, and you've said it in the context of the Council conclusions, which I recall are the member states defining their wishes to the Commission and also to their counterparts, if we went in the same direction because we want the same thing. For Creative Europe specifically, for example, I can say we have looked at culture. in particular our cooperation projects, which is the biggest budget that we have in culture. And we have seen that accessibility remains difficult, in particular for very small organizations that make up this sector. And we have therefore, for example, increased to 80% our co-funding. It's not a lot, but I think it was a concrete step forward to say, okay, now you only need to bring 20% of your own funds if you want to do something with partners from other countries. And this is very successful, and we're also allowing smaller projects to grow. We've introduced a medium range size of project, and this is proving extremely successful, I think, in particular for the areas that we're looking into now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is a great transition, I think, for the next bit of our discussion. I think, Justina, you had a quick video that you wanted to show us, and I think it's going to translate very well into something more tangible for you, what we've been talking about, especially, you know, about these new ways to support the news media, culture, the creative industries. So maybe if you want to show us that quick bit and give us a little bit of context, obviously, because this is one of the projects that is funded by the News Initiative, so Creative Europe, correct?
No, it's actually funded from preparatory actions.
From a preparatory action. Yeah. Well, that's really technical, but it's the overarching framework of support to the news media provided by the EU, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe a bit of context, because
absolutely.
Let's make it more tangible.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, well, first of all, I have come across this, and I was really impressed, Arthur, with the portal explaining different types of funding, and also something for people who are interested in news. There is this great page now, News Initiatives page. If I knew it before, I wouldn't have to study and learn, because sometimes it's complex, but now it's really very interesting and very, very accessible. So I think accessibility is also communicating information about this. So this is really this is an excellent way to facilitate access and understanding of what resources are available. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we are supporting our members, and through the EBU Brussels office, we've been able, and with consortium partners, including France Télévisions, we've been able to obtain one of the grants under preparatory actions. And this is really to promote sharing content, online news between public service media. And we are also cooperating with other institutions on this project, such as Constructive Journalism Institute. So I think it's hard to explain. It's best if we can see a very short video about what this project is about.
Let's do that.
Public service media make up Europe's largest newsroom. They invest 5.5 billion euros a year and employ more than 40,000 journalists to deliver independent, trusted news every second of every day. And now, they're driving a unique editorial and technical collaboration, a European perspective, harnessing the scale and power of EBU members. A European perspective brings online audiences the best journalism in their own languages. Together, we're throwing light on the issues affecting all European citizens and putting our own journalism into perspective by seeing how those issues are reported elsewhere. In a world of information overload and language barriers, each editor recommends their best stories to their counterparts in other countries. This is made possible by a state-of-the-art software platform using the latest machine learning. It's powered by Peach, the EBU's personalization and recommendation system, and Eurovox for transcribing, translating, revoicing, and subtitling multilingual content. Text, video, and audio news, all translated into several different languages. A European perspective is embedded directly into members' own websites. It will enable us to build a culture of mutual understanding, helping to inform the public by guiding them to trusted news sources and countering disinformation. By innovating together at EBU Brussels, we can create a truly European perspective.
So thank you for letting me show the video. With this, this is just an example of many really invaluable projects that are going on in Europe. But I think that what I wanted to show is that at the core of most of the projects, whether it's news or cultural, it's both editorial or content cooperation, but also technology cooperation. So if I think about the future and the future, you know, even beyond 2027, I think, and we had those exchanges with other colleagues who were presenting at different fora, other EU-funded projects. One of the many conclusions was that when we look ahead, we have to think perhaps also at bringing greater kind of integration and longer term vision for impact. Because, as I said, these projects are not anymore sometimes small pilots. The pilots are very important to test the innovation. But if we want to have impact long term, if we are really serious about creating European digital public sphere, it's important that we prioritize and really concentrate the efforts and remember that it's not only, you know, about content or about exchanging skill. The core of it is also technology, and they go hand in hand.
Oh, of course, of course. Thank you very much, Justina. This was a very good and concrete and tangible way to see how these new tools and these new ways to support our cultural and creative and news industries are being deployed right now at EU level. I see the clock is ticking, and I'm pretty sure that at least some of you have questions or maybe comments or maybe remarks for our speakers. I would love to ask them more questions, but I have to do my job now, and I have to open the floor to you all in the audience. Obviously, feel free to ask questions in French, or in English, or in German. No, maybe Barbara can do it, but we'll be struggling. Polish will be even harder. Let's try to stick to French and English, if you can. We have one question here, a second there. Maybe the first hand was raised here, and then the gentleman in the purple shirt. Or is that? Yeah.
Thanks. I'll speak in French, I think.
Français, allons-y.
J'ai deux questions.
Well, I have two simple questions. Can you introduce yourself to start with? I'm a teacher and a research director in the area of cultural, creative, and digital industry. So first question, it is nice to develop gateways and to promote private funding. Do you have any sort of, let's say, watch out for all the funds that who would like to fund? If a startup who is looking for funds, well, they are intermediaries, and those intermediaries are not necessarily, knowledgeable in terms of finding the right funding. So you have had the 6 months of French presidency, and this didn't make the work of the French Ministry of Culture necessarily easy. So what's the has there been any, let's say, positive things that happened, or just moderating meetings? Well, unfortunately, that is not our mandate today. But well, you did try, but it's not our mandate. So, but well, anybody willing to try and answer this question? Arthur, to start with.
On mapping VC equity funds, that hasn't been done so far. We have done attempts in that as part of the work we are doing on the guarantee facility of Creative Europe. So we were working with banks and helping them to invest in culture and creative industries. Some of them were looking at investing jointly with equity funds. So we have done some searches on that, but that's not publicly available, unfortunately. So there is a bit of work, but no systematic mapping. That's one thing. However, one very easy way to identify those funds would be through the new equity instrument, because funds will need to apply in order to benefit from some support. So there will be a sort of list of funds looking at really investing in the cultural and creative industries. It won't be comprehensive, but depending on how many apply, it can be a very good starting point. So that would be how I would answer that. Yep. Happy to discuss afterwards as well. I can give you some hints.
No, obviously, I mean, these instruments are, of course, constantly developing. And as you rightly say, it's by doing that we see what exists and what is being done already. This is, of course, also the role of the European Commission to do that. And of course, if I can say positively on the French presidency, all those efforts that were made to kind of stimulate this exchange and also collect this information and these data is very welcome. And this is something that needs to be done. But of course, as I said now, we don't have our own small financial instrument anymore. We're now part of a bigger program. And there, of course, we need to make sure also that our sector receives the necessary attention and also the necessary tools. So, but we're not there yet. You see, I mean, Creative Europe introduced the guarantee mechanism as late as 2016-17. It only developed. It's still fairly new. And I think we can be proud we had it. It was quite successful despite of what we thought in the beginning. If I can put it like that, everything which was not audiovisual, everybody thought, oh, it's going to be only for those film people. And it turned out not to be the case. It had an impact on the fashion industry, on the music industry, on design in general. Those sectors that we have also now specifically and on purpose included in Creative Europe as specific sectors which we want to support. So this is really, it's fairly new. So I think we need a little bit more time to make this mapping and this monitoring. But indeed, as in everything, I mean, our joint past, also Fabien and Mathieu in the music dialogue, it's always about where is data available, how do we collect data, how much do we actually depend on voluntarily gathering data from different sources. And if we talk about money, this is also, it's banks, it's financial institutions. It's not as clearly cut maybe as if you talk about only public funding, which is more readily available. So it's a little bit more challenging to have all this information. And I think, Arthur, as you said rightly, this is where we depend also on applications that we see coming into being, and then we can do something with it.
Can I add? No, I think it's a very, very good question. I mean, we have all these programs and projects available. People want to apply, but you also have people who want to invest in culture, in the creative sectors. And the loan guarantee helped to a certain extent to give visibility to some of those institutions. I mean, I was not aware of some of them, some of our members were not, but maybe we need to work more on that and have a listing of institutions, funds, they want to invest more in this sector and people are there who need money, so we make them meet.
Yeah, that would be a great exercise. I think everybody agrees on that. Yeah. Barbara?
I mentioned projects that we support. Several of you around the table may know it. For example, our support that we give to a platform which is called Fedora, typically also a very nice French project. But that is something that is working on innovation in the opera and ballet areas. It's also an industry, obviously, but it may be less considered typically an industry. But as you also said, Arthur, the performing arts are also seeing themselves in this vein. And they are very much working also on these new business models that we think we need to develop, so we can learn, and this is what we want to do in Europe. We can try to learn from projects that exist, where partners learn already from each other across borders. This is really our added value.
Right.
And if those new ideas and new developments could then also kind of spill over to other sectors and to other projects, this is really what would be already a big success in my eyes.
Right. We had a second question. Ça peut être en français aussi, hein, si vous êtes plus à l'aise. Aucun problème.
You can ask in French as well.
From Europa Cinemas, so a network of European cinema who is promoting European screenings in the cinema theaters. And I had two questions, because now, as you all said it, we have a lot of challenges in the culture sector, some of them that are specific to each sector, and some others that are the same for everyone, so environment, inclusion, etc. So we are kind of dispersing ourselves on all of these challenges with money that is not infinite, of course. And so my first question is, how do you make this money matter in the end? We have the same amount of money, a bit more, of course, but how do you make it so that it's efficient and that we are able to tackle all of this without forgetting something or making too much on another one? And the other question is, for a European structure, how do you make sure that your efforts are not specifically targeting one or two or three countries, but every one of them? For instance, it's easy for environment to, let's say, help French or German industries because they are quite advanced in this subject, while other countries are a bit far less advanced, and we need to find a balance for all of them.
I guess, thank you so much. Well, I guess those questions are directed at the European Commission, if I'm not mistaken.
Really? I think it's very good questions that you're asking, and
let's keep the clock in mind, okay,
I'm
Barbara?
keeping, yeah, well, you know me well, I can speak forever, he knows me too well. We remain a program to support the cultural and creative sector. And I stress that because we are not becoming, despite of all the challenges that we are facing and that you cannot deny, and they are all almost equally important. Nobody would say that inclusion is less important than our ecological concerns, for example. And all of those challenges are the challenges that the sector is facing, so we cannot say we ignore them. On the other hand, you're absolutely right to say we need to focus. Our focus is helping the sector meet those challenges and give them the possibility to react to those challenges. But we are not becoming a green program. We are not there only to contribute to the Green Deal. Yes, we need to make sure that our projects don't do harm to the environment, and we're asking all our project applicants to say at least how are you thinking about it? How do you consider what will be the environmental impact of what you will be doing? We are not judging them solely on this, obviously, because that would create the imbalance that you're talking about. And I've said it in other fora, it's extremely important for us that we don't create new imbalances and new injustices, in particular if we talk about ecological transition. You're absolutely right. It's easy for me coming from Brussels by train to Paris no problem. But if I'm on a Greek island or on Serbia mainland, you know, I may find it difficult to travel by train through the whole continent and be environmentally friendly. So this needs to be carefully balanced, absolutely, and this is why we ask our experts when they look at applications, okay, check, have they at least thought about it? You cannot today support a project that hasn't given a thought about gender equality or inclusion. That's totally impossible. Same for the ecological concerns, but you have to look at the project for what it is, where it comes from, and the possibilities it has. And this is really something that we will need to look at. I mean, if we look at ecological transitions, we're looking at slow touring. We're looking at how to reduce all in the area of performing arts. We've had now a very nice pilot project which is called Perform Europe. This was a big aspect of how to develop also in the area of performing arts to become more sustainable. So this is definitely always a balance that we need to strike, not wipe out one challenge with a new challenge. But nonetheless, all the challenges that were mentioned are those that the sectors are facing. So we cannot ignore them, because without looking at them, sectors, in our opinion, will not be able to become resilient again and face the future. Maybe short-term successful, okay, but if we look mid-term, long-term, we have to consider all those big priority questions that we talked about.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I hope it answers your question. So if I remember correctly, there was a question from the lady in the back. You have the microphone, perfect. Let's try to be brief. We have less than 3 minutes on the clock.
Oui, bonjour.
Bonjour. Présentez-vous rapidement si vous le pouvez.
Je ne sais pas si ça marche. Ok. Bonjour, je suis chargée de mission au réseau des théâtres à l'italienne européen.
So I'm responsible for a mission at the European level. So one of the first things that we see among people, one of the first problems they encounter is creating the project and then assessing it. It can be quite, in fact, discouraging. And, you know, we cannot be overwhelmed, in fact, by the paperwork. Are you going to try to facilitate, simplify the requests for this financing access? My answer is simple. Yes, we intend to simplify things. But in order to achieve a certain level of simplification, you always need to invest a lot. So we're constantly working on this, and we're aware of the difficulties that exist, but we're constantly working on simplification. And unfortunately, I have to say that there are hundreds and thousands of projects which succeed. So yes, it's difficult, but there are a lot of projects which make the effort, especially with regards to the reporting, for example. We need to simplify that reporting process, because once you've received the support to make this less costly. Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Unfortunately, I saw other hands raised.
Have to wrap up. It's a tight schedule today. I'm moderating another panel in 15 minutes. So, you know, I'm so sorry we can go further into the discussion. But we have a few seconds just to say a big thank you and to do a big round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much. Thank you. This was a great discussion. I hope you liked it as much as I did. And see you in 15 minutes for the next panel.
Merci.
Des écoles aussi qui se lancent dans la promotion de l'apprentissage, et donc là ça fait une insertion réellement, et puis ça permet aussi de conforter ou d'infirmer des choix. Ça existe, et nous je vois, là tout récemment on a une étudiante qui était en 5e année dans une filière très technique, qui avait fait son alternance dans une agence d'urbanisme, qui a décidé de ne pas passer son diplôme en disant finalement ça m'a appris, j'ai trouvé ma voie, ce n'est pas ce que je veux faire.
C'est exactement ce que j'allais vous dire, et ça ne m'étonne pas en tant que directrice d'école que, avant tout, vous vous intéressiez à un parcours qui est ponctué par des diplômes, et que ce soit avec des passerelles, éventuellement une licence d'archi qui peut mener ailleurs. Mais voilà, je voulais quand même insister sur le fait que, au-delà de la question du diplôme, on pouvait aussi sortir en 2e, en 3e, en 4e année. J'ai connu des étudiants qui sont partis en Master 1. On peut se dire, allez, un an de plus et on a un diplôme, un bac plus 5 en poche. Mais voilà, ça existe aussi, donc voilà, vous m'avez coupé l'herbe sous le pied avec cet exemple-là.
Et puis pas des étudiants qui ne réussissent pas, en fait. Ce sont parfois des choix, et moi, au titre de directrice, je considère que là, l'école a réussi. C'est-à-dire qu'à un moment donné, on a formé un adulte qui décide d'un choix de vie.
Je peux vous parler de mon amie qui était partie, qui était devenue couvreuse en bâtiment, d'une autre amie qui était devenue illustratrice, tant de camarades de classe qui ont... Bon, d'une autre qui avait fait médecine, mais ça c'est encore autre chose. Mais on va dans un instant peut-être vous donner la parole si vous avez des témoignages ici dans la salle à apporter, ou des questions à poser pour préciser un petit peu tout ce qui a été dit. Je précise qu'on va déborder un tout petit peu l'heure de fin prévue, parce qu'on a commencé très très en retard. Donc si on pouvait récupérer ne serait-ce qu'un petit quart d'heure en plus de celui qui nous reste, ça va nous permettre quand même de continuer d'approfondir un petit peu certains sujets. Juste avant qu'on fasse tourner un micro dans la salle, on va peut-être écouter Céline Guichard qui, là encore, un autre parcours qu'on a évoqué uniquement dans le sommaire de notre discussion, mais finalement qui n'est pas encore revenu sur la table, celui des architectes fonctionnaires. Racontez-nous, Céline Guichard, je rappelle que vous êtes chef de projet développement durable des territoires à la direction régionale et interdépartementale de l'environnement, de l'aménagement et des transports. Architecte de la sphère publique, qu'est-ce que c'est ?
Bonjour, merci tout d'abord de m'avoir invitée. Donc, architecte urbaniste de l'État. J'avoue, quand j'étais étudiante à l'ENSA de Bretagne, je n'en avais jamais entendu parler, très clairement. J'ai démarré dans une agence comme salariée, et finalement, c'est un peu le hasard des rencontres qui fait qu'un jour, j'ai rencontré des architectes urbanistes de l'État qui m'ont dit « Écoute, tu as le profil ». Parce que toi, ce qui t'intéresse, c'est d'être justement en amont du projet, comprendre pourquoi il y a cette commande, pourquoi à la fin on nous dit voilà, vous êtes sur cette parcelle et vous avez des règles du jeu. Mais moi, ce qui m'intéressait, c'est de savoir pourquoi on avait donné ces règles du jeu. Donc, effectivement, moi j'ai passé mon diplôme donc DPLG, ancienne génération, en 2001, et finalement j'ai passé le concours d'AUE, architecte urbaniste de l'État, en 2004. Les architectes urbanistes de l'État, en tout, on est à peu près 500. Donc quand je vois le ratio 50 000 diplômés en archi, 30 000 à l'ordre, et puis 500 architectes urbanistes de l'État, très clairement, on est minoritaire. Et pourtant, pourquoi s'engager dans cette voie ? Moi, ça a été une grande découverte. Pour préparer le concours, j'ai d'abord fait une prépa à l'école d'archi de Lyon, ainsi qu'une formation continue sur les métiers de la maîtrise d'ouvrage public. Et j'ai découvert qu'en fait, les compétences qu'on avait acquises pendant toutes ces années d'architecture, on pouvait les transférer autrement, construire autrement le monde de demain. C'est vrai que moi, j'avais une sensibilité forte, moins pour être architecte du roi, plus pour faire de l'architecture pour de l'homme, comme disait notre prof en sociologie, je me souviens très bien, en première année. Et donc, j'ai tout de suite été sensible à ce métier pour devenir ce que j'ai appelé acteur des politiques publiques. Donc oui, la question de la conduite de projet, de l'idée, de la conception, aujourd'hui, je m'en sers encore tous les jours, différemment. Il m'arrive, je ne conçois plus des bâtiments, mais je conçois des politiques publiques, des idées, et qui peuvent être très diverses. La chance dans cette voie, c'est qu'on peut changer de métier 10 fois au sein du parcours.
Peut-être justement un mot sur cette diversité des métiers, parce que, alors vous-même déjà, vous avez pu cocher plusieurs cases dans quelques-unes de cette diversité, mais ce que vous nous montrez aussi à travers les quelques visuels que vous nous avez transmis, c'est que oui, on comprend que c'est très large. Est-ce qu'on peut donner peut-être juste quelques exemples de ce grand écart?
Oui, très concret. Donc, quand on intègre le corps des architectes urbanistes de l'État, donc déjà, on appartient soit, c'est un corps interministériel, donc on peut travailler pour le ministère de la Culture. Vous connaissez tous les architectes des bâtiments de France, donc c'est ce concours-là. C'est un concours commun avec les architectes urbanistes côté aménagement, ça on le sait moins, qui dépendent du ministère de la Transition écologique, qui change régulièrement de nom. Donc moi je suis du MTE, mais j'ai eu la chance aussi de pouvoir travailler au ministère de la Culture, car comme son nom l'indique, c'est un concours interministériel. Aujourd'hui, pour répondre aux différents métiers, donc il y a ABF, dont vous avez tous entendu parler. Donc ce sont des missions qui sont à la fois régaliennes, mais aussi beaucoup de conseils auprès des élus, au plus près des territoires, de préservation du patrimoine, le développement durable avant l'heure, j'ai envie de dire, l'existant. Ce sont aussi des métiers de management. Donc là, il y a toutes les filières, alors beaucoup en aménagement, pour le coup, au ministère de la Transition écologique, des métiers de chef de service, directeur d'établissement public, directeur en direction centrale. Alors, ça vous parle peut-être pas, mais c'est vraiment il y a les cabinets ministériels, il y a le ministre, les cabinets ministériels, et puis il y a les administrations centrales et déconcentrées, c'est-à-dire dans les territoires, qui mettent en œuvre des politiques nationales et les déclinent sur le terrain. Très concrètement... Corinne Langlois, on l'a vu tout à l'heure. Exactement, voilà. Qui est architecte urbaniste de l'État. Aujourd'hui, la directrice générale des services de la métropole de Lyon est une architecte urbaniste de l'État. Donc là, quand on disait être au plus près des politiques, c'est vraiment contribuer à les construire, c'est-à-dire décider de mettre en œuvre une politique volontariste sur l'aménagement durable, sur la mobilité durable, sur la mixité sociale. Et ça, c'est des sujets qui m'ont toujours touchée. Donc concrètement, j'ai donné quelques exemples de postes dans lesquels j'ai pu travailler. Donc j'ai travaillé en direction, alors à l'époque c'était la DDE, la direction. Aujourd'hui, ce sont les directions départementales des territoires. Donc là, j'étais plus sur des sujets d'aménagement, de conseil auprès des élus. Donc c'est important d'avoir à un moment donné cette casquette d'architecte assez terrain. On est entouré de nos collègues qui sont plutôt techniques et plutôt avec des profils administratifs. Et nous, on fait le lien entre ce terrain. J'ai travaillé sur des projets en rue, par exemple, de la rénovation urbaine. Et là, en face de moi, j'ai les maîtres d'œuvre de ces projets, maîtrise d'œuvre urbaine, de ces projets de quartier. Et du coup, il y a un vrai dialogue qui peut se faire. On est un peu à l'interface entre l'administration et puis la maîtrise d'œuvre. Donc, c'est assez passionnant. Et honnêtement, on trouve tout à fait notre place. Après, très concrètement, j'ai travaillé aussi au CEREMA, directrice d'études, sur des sujets beaucoup plus d'expertise. D'ailleurs, aujourd'hui, je suis revenue sur l'expertise après des expériences de management parce que c'est plus ce que j'aime faire. Et j'ai mis une image, là, on voit, il y a une personne en situation de handicap, aveugle. Il se trouve, quand j'ai travaillé sur une étude sur la lisibilité urbaine, donc là, c'était au CEREMA, qui est un établissement public administratif, qui produit des études, notamment sur la ville durable. Et là, on a travaillé sur des parcours avec des personnes en situation de handicap, de vieillissement dans la ville de Grenoble pour comprendre ce qui aujourd'hui était compliqué pour se déplacer, etc. Donc ça, c'est une des parties du boulot. J'ai travaillé sur un référentiel ville durable européen. Donc on a dû aller à Bruxelles un nombre de fois incalculable, créer des consortiums avec des chercheurs de tous les pays européens. Enfin moi, j'ai l'impression d'avoir eu 1000 vies en finalement assez peu de temps. Et voilà, il y a le Forum urbain mondial. On a eu la chance de pouvoir présenter l'album des jeunes architectes et paysagistes. Donc on est là aussi pour porter la parole de ce qui compte pour nous, c'est-à-dire la ville durable, bâtir autrement, la question de l'économie circulaire, vous en parliez tout à l'heure, les filières. Et l'architecte, finalement, on s'aperçoit qu'il est à la croisée de ses chemins. J'ai pas parlé de l'habitat, mais j'ai été pendant 5 ans adjointe d'un service habitat au niveau régional. Donc là, c'est les questions des publics, de l'hébergement d'urgence. Donc évidemment, on voit aussi le côté, j'allais dire, la mécanique politique, mais elle est essentielle. Et juste pour terminer, moi j'ai le sentiment qu'en école d'architecture, à l'époque, je pense que ça a vraiment évolué, mais à l'époque, je ne connaissais pas le monde dans lequel je vivais. Et je pense que c'est un handicap terrible quand on est architecte et qu'on ne sait pas que les décisions sont prises, qu'il y a des préfets, des directions, tout ce millefeuille des collectivités, on n'en a aucune idée et on passe à côté de tant de missions, tant de travail pour parler concrètement. Moi, j'ai quand même des amis de promo, bon, les périodes se succèdent et ne sont pas les mêmes, mais il y a eu des périodes quand même très difficiles. Un certain nombre d'entre eux ont même arrêté le métier d'architecte. D'autres sont maintenant, j'ai une amie qui est dans les assurances pour les architectes, mais enfin voilà, c'est des métiers très divers et ils y trouvent aussi plein d'intérêt. Mais ce que je veux dire, c'est que aujourd'hui, la contradiction, c'est que ce concours architecte urbaniste de l'État, personne ne le connaît et on n'a pas assez de candidats. Donc je vous invite à je fais de la pub, carrément. Je vous invite vraiment à vous renseigner sur ce concours. Je peux discuter avec vous après si vous le souhaitez. Et à vous engager parce que si vous voulez changer de métier très régulièrement, venez, rejoignez-nous, quoi.
Mais alors justement, c'est un petit détail technique, mais pour bien comprendre. Tout à l'heure, on évoquait la diversité des études d'architecture, la diversité des pratiques du métier d'architecte, on va dire entre guillemets privé. Là, on se rend compte du côté public qu'il y a là encore une très grande diversité de manières d'exercer. C'est vraiment un seul concours qui permet tout ça, c'est-à-dire que, ça paraît, il n'y a pas de formation complémentaire d'un poste à un autre.
Le concours. Donc c'est un concours déjà qui est un peu particulier, qui est assez impliquant. Donc il y a des épreuves dites écrites standard entre guillemets avec dissertation, analyse critique, etc. Et puis il y a une épreuve de dessin. Donc une épreuve. Alors à l'époque, quand je l'ai passée, il y avait 2 épreuves de 12 heures. Donc c'est assez. Donc il faut faire une grande planche, un grand projet. Et aujourd'hui, c'est une épreuve de 12 heures d'aménagement urbain pour ceux qui choisissent la filière aménagement, et puis sur un bâtiment patrimonial pour ceux qui choisissent d'être ABF. Ensuite, il y a des oraux. Grosso modo, chaque année, il y a un peu plus d'une centaine. Alors, il y a eu des époques où il y avait beaucoup plus de monde, mais aujourd'hui, on est à... Par exemple, cette année, je faisais partie du jury. Il y a eu 135 candidats. On en a choisi 9. Voilà. On en a donc.
Vous disiez que vous manquez de candidatures.
Oui, mais parce que c'est un concours exigeant. C'est un concours exigeant et qui est suivi ensuite d'une année de formation à l'école nationale des ponts Paris-Tech. C'est ça, maintenant on l'appelle comme ça, ponts et chaussées. Et puis l'école de Chaillot. Donc c'est une année absolument passionnante où on rentre dans les coulisses de l'État aussi, coulisses de tous ces métiers, du Conseil d'État. Enfin, moi, ça a été une grande découverte. Enfin, tous les champs se sont tout d'un coup ouverts. Donc, c'est une formation à l'issue duquel, donc, on a plusieurs périodes de stage. On a 2 mois de stage dans des services, plus 2 semaines dans un autre service qui est dans l'autre ministère, en fait, de celui pour lequel on est dédié au départ. Et puis, il y a un projet de fin d'études à l'issue duquel on est ou pas titularisé. Donc, c'est une année assez exigeante aussi, mais passionnante, donc qui se passe à Paris. Voilà.
Et dans le cadre de la formation qui suit le concours, j'imagine qu'il y a aussi des modules qui peuvent permettre déjà de s'orienter peut-être un peu plus, ou alors c'est vraiment que du tronc commun?
Non, là c'est vraiment principalement du tronc commun. Il peut y avoir quelques options avec des colorations plus patrimoniales ou plus aménagement. On a accès aussi à certains modules de l'école des ponts proprement dit, donc avec les étudiants de l'école des ponts. Non, c'est une chance assez inouïe. Et on est payé pendant cette année-là. Je le dis parce que
tronc commun tout de même pas avec les ABF, les architectes des bâtiments.
Bien sûr que si, bien sûr que si, bien sûr que si.
C'est vraiment très proche, finalement.
Si, bien sûr que si. On est une promo. Les AUE, en fait, les architectes urbanistes de l'État, c'est le corps interministériel, et on est mélangé avec les architectes des bâtiments de France.
Juste une dernière question, et puis on va ouvrir la discussion au public, mais vous avez évoqué tout un tas de convictions aussi que vous partez à travers ces différentes missions-là, et j'ai pu regarder, je vous ai demandé votre CV avant de mener cette discussion, et j'ai vu qu'il était beaucoup question de participation citoyenne, de développement durable, et je me suis demandé en fait de quelle manière, en exerçant au nom de l'État, vous arriviez tout de même à défendre vos propres convictions, parce que finalement, vous défendez aussi une politique de l'État. Elle pourrait aussi être moins en lien avec ce que vous croyez. Là où un architecte indépendant va pouvoir prendre la direction qu'il veut, vous êtes tout de même un petit peu contraint d'une politique nationale.
Alors, c'est vrai que quand on intègre un corps ministériel, on doit aussi effectivement porter les politiques publiques. Alors fort heureusement, il y a quand même un certain nombre de politiques publiques auxquelles on adhère pleinement, et donc c'est bien dans ce cadre-là qu'on va œuvrer. Techniquement, on a aussi des moyens d'agir pour justement sur le terrain porter ce qui est vraiment en accord avec nos convictions. Après, en toute honnêteté, moi j'ai parfois changé de poste aussi pour me diriger vers des choses qui me correspondaient davantage. Tout simplement, on a quand même une possibilité d'évoluer et de changer de poste. Alors il y a deux manières de le faire. On peut le faire, il y a un certain nombre de mes confrères et consoeurs qui vont faire une carrière plutôt dans du management de plus en plus important, dans des structures pour arriver travailler dans des cabinets ministériels, etc. Et puis, moi, j'ai fait un choix qui est plutôt de suivre les sensibilités que j'ai sur le fond, le terrain, les gens, en fait. C'est ça qui m'intéresse. C'est pour ça que j'ai mis ces deux dessins. Bon, voilà, changement climatique, etc. Mais ça a vraiment du sens pour moi. J'ai envie de me lever le matin et de me dire que ce que je fais, c'est utile.
Je vois qu'il est 11h, on a dit qu'on débordait un tout petit peu, je vous prie de m'excuser, on a effectivement commencé un petit peu en retard, et là aussi je vous prie de m'en excuser. On va peut-être pouvoir ouvrir un petit peu la discussion, et ça peut être l'occasion, ou en tout cas ensuite on reviendra peut-être un petit peu aussi sur les études. J'aurai quelques sujets là-dessus peut-être pour préciser un petit peu le débat, mais voilà, si parmi vous autres qui êtes ici à l'amphithéâtre Nord de l'école d'architecture de Paris-Belleville, voilà, si vous avez envie peut-être soit d'apporter un témoignage, une expérience, de poser une question pour approfondir quelque chose qui aura été dit. Et je sais que ça met toujours du temps à avoir la première question, et ensuite il y en a 1000 derrière. Mais je crois que madame... Non, oui, voilà. On a la première question. Merci pour cette dévotion. Vous allez voir que vous ouvrez une voie, j'en suis sûr. Si vous voulez peut-être juste vous présenter avant de prendre la parole, qu'on puisse bien comprendre votre point de vue.
Bonjour, Magali Majidi. Donc, j'ai travaillé longtemps au sein de la fonction publique en tant qu'architecte, et donc je retrouve des similitudes avec le dernier témoignage. Et puis aussi dans des boîtes de programmation, des agences qui travaillaient sur l'ingénierie culturelle et l'espace public. Et je retrouve du coup aussi beaucoup d'écho avec le travail de Bénédicte
Maillet, oui.
Voilà, merci. J'avais peur d'écorcher le nom. Et voici 6 mois, avec une amie, on a décidé de monter une structure. On s'est inscrit du coup à l'Ordre des architectes, où on a eu un très très bon accueil. Ceci dit, on a été confrontés, c'est pour ça que je me permets de prendre le micro, à quelques soucis, parce qu'en fait, on ne fait pas de maîtrise d'œuvre. Et donc, le postulat de dire on ne fait pas de maîtrise d'œuvre a été... on avait une pédagogie, en fait, à mener au sein des intervenants, surtout lors de l'entretien que l'on a avec quelqu'un de l'ordre qui appréciait, en fait, notre profil pour autoriser ou pas l'inscription. Donc, on était 2 personnes avec un profil similaire, mais avec des parcours quand même différents. On a toujours travaillé en maîtrise d'ouvrage pour la moitié de notre carrière, puis en maîtrise d'œuvre dans des agences au début. Et en fait, je voulais témoigner du fait que esprit voilà, d'ouverture. Voilà, nous, en tout cas, on a été bien accueillis, mais on l'a pas... C'était compliqué à faire comprendre vers où nous voulions aller. Et la deuxième chose...
Vous l'avez eu, pardon, votre inscription
oui.
à l'ordre? Oui, d'accord.
Oui, oui.
Ah oui,
Alors,
j'ai cru
eu.
que vous alliez dire ils ont été super sympas, ils ont bien compris notre projet, mais ils nous ont dit non.
Ouais,
Non,
en fait,
ils ont dit
alors, oui. Oui, voilà, c'est-à-dire que exactement, c'est positif tout ça, mais je voulais témoigner du fait que oui, il y a eu un temps où on s'est vraiment, nous, avec mon associé, on était très inquiètes. Et la deuxième chose, c'est que justement, très pragmatique, mais au niveau des assurances, pour aller à l'ordre, pour s'inscrire à l'ordre, il faut une assurance. On n'est pas inscrit on a interrogé la MAF, on a interrogé beaucoup d'assurances, on a eu un mal fou à trouver. Je ne sais pas si c'est juste une situation isolée, mais on a eu beaucoup de mal à trouver une assurance professionnelle qui puisse couvrir notre champ d'action. Donc,
alors ça, c'est hyper intéressant. Et ça, si vous êtes là toute la journée, on a un intervenant de la MAF justement qui...
Je me suis inscrite à l'atelier.
Et ben voilà, donc on va pouvoir lui poser la question directement. Et même si effectivement ça fait écho aussi à notre discussion là tout de suite, je me permets peut-être de garder votre témoignage pour vous inviter tous à participer aux autres tables rondes de la journée. Ça fait vraiment le lien avec tout ce qu'on disait. Et je vous remercie aussi pour la première partie du témoignage. Voilà, qui permet tout de même... Enfin, c'était très intéressant la discussion qu'on a eue juste tout à l'heure entre Bénédicte Maillet et Marjane Essamfar et ça nous rappelle bien que voilà, il y a un vrai sujet sur cette question de l'ouverture du tableau de l'ordre, que c'était vraiment pas évident jusque-là, que c'est pas encore le cas, mais qu'on note une ouverture potentielle qui se rapproche. Pour rester dans nos discussions, alors peut-être si quelqu'un d'autre veut prendre la parole, on redonne un tout petit temps de parole à la fin de notre discussion qui aura lieu dans 9 minutes. Juste avant, pour revenir quand même sur la question des études d'architecture, Véronique Bio, on se rend compte vraiment de la diversité des métiers, encore une fois, et j'ai pas arrêté d'utiliser ce mot de diversité, mais c'est vraiment à toutes les échelles, et à chaque fois qu'on essaye de restreindre un petit peu le sujet, tiens, on va parler des architectes public, et puis en fait on se rend compte que même là il y a une énorme diversité. Pour ouvrir encore plus, parlons de ces études d'architecture qui peuvent mener effectivement très loin. Est-ce que vous avez réussi à définir un tronc commun autour de tout ça? Alors, tout à l'heure, le mot construire, et je vous remercie encore Bénédicte Maillet de m'avoir repris là-dessus, parce que finalement, il y a beaucoup de construction à travers tout ce que l'on dit, et même Céline Guichard, vous parliez de construire des politiques publiques. Donc voilà, on est vraiment dans tous les usages du mot de construction. Je ne sais pas si c'est un terme ou un sujet, mais quel serait le tronc commun de tout ce que l'on évoque depuis tout à l'heure, Véronique Bio?
Oui, ça c'est une question difficile. Effectivement, comme disait Amina, les enseignants... Ça marche pas, je crois.
Oui, ça marche. Ouais.
Ça marche. Les enseignants des écoles d'architecture se mobilisent beaucoup sur la réflexion pédagogique, sur les modalités de la pédagogie. Il faut peut-être dire que dans les écoles d'architecture, il y a vraiment une grande diversité des modalités de transmission des connaissances. Il y a les cours traditionnels, mais il y a l'atelier, il y a le workshop dans lequel les étudiants peuvent être amenés à aller dans un territoire pendant une semaine pour travailler avec les acteurs locaux. Voilà, il y a tout un tas de modalités qui sont travaillées. Il y a beaucoup la réflexion sur l'échelle 1, notamment dans l'enseignement des techniques de la construction et du projet d'architecture, l'idée de travailler en vraie grandeur.
Au sommaire de notre table ronde de début d'après-midi. Voilà.
Oui,
merci pour le lien.
Les liens sont nombreux. Donc il y a beaucoup d'effervescence dans les écoles d'architecture sur la réflexion pédagogique. On est en train de monter, je regarde Caroline Le Courtois qui est là, un gros projet de recherche justement sur un diagnostic et peut-être par la suite des propositions de transformation de l'enseignement, parce qu'on se rend compte du défi qu'il y a d'adapter les formations à toutes ces évolutions qu'on a mentionnées les unes et les autres, ces transitions écologiques, numériques, environnementales bien sûr, sociales, avec la question du vieillissement des populations urbaines. Enfin, il y a tout un tas de questions qui se mettent en évidence et qui transforment le rôle de l'architecte. Donc non, je crois qu'il y a beaucoup à faire encore pour adapter les enseignements. Et comme disait Amina, je pense qu'une des ressources, ça va être la possibilité pour les étudiants d'avoir des parcours un peu à la carte, avec cette question des doubles diplômes, avec toutes ces formations que l'on voit qu'ils font avant, après, pendant les études d'architecture. Donc depuis le CAP de charpente, de menuiserie, le DNMA de design d'espace, jusqu'aux formations en programmation, en urbanisme, en paysage. Il y a vraiment une grande gamme de formations complémentaires qui intéressent les étudiants en architecture. Et on n'a pas mentionné, donc j'en profite, de dire les étudiantes, parce que peut-être la table en donne une idée, mais il faut bien préciser le processus de féminisation intense des études d'architecture. On a maintenant plus de 57% des étudiants qui sont des étudiantes.
La difficulté pour les étudiantes, elle se situe plutôt après les études, en l'occurrence, et notamment dans la gestion des agences d'architecture, où là, pour le coup, la parité s'inverse.
Oui, en effet, il y a des travaux là-dessus et il faut continuer à en développer parce qu'on ne connaît pas très bien encore tous les tenants et les aboutissants de ce phénomène de féminisation. Ce qu'on observe, bien sûr, c'est des femmes qui vont plutôt du côté de la fonction publique, qui vont plutôt du côté du salariat dans les agences que du côté des fonctions de gestionnaire, de directeur d'agence, des salaires qui sont effectivement assez dissymétriques, des longueurs aussi de carrière professionnelle qui sont différentes, on le sait dans d'autres métiers aussi, hein, donc c'est des choses qu'il faut maintenant qu'on regarde de plus près pour ce qui concerne les architectes.
Et alors, peut-être un dernier mot, peut-être Bénédicte Maillet, puisque on a pris le temps tout à l'heure de raconter un petit peu votre pratique. J'aurais bien aimé, puisque vraiment notre discussion est sur la question est intitulée « Quel métier après des études d'architecture ?» Je voulais vous interroger sur le lien entre vos études et votre pratique aujourd'hui du métier, et de quelle manière vous pouviez envisager ce que vous faites aujourd'hui comme étant la suite de vos études. Est-ce que c'était des pistes déjà lorsque vous étiez sur les bancs de l'école ? Ah ouais, allez-y, le micro s'ouvre en même temps que vous parlez. Voilà.
J'en avais jamais entendu parler. Mais j'ai un parcours un peu particulier qui m'a emmené là. J'ai fait un master recherche en parallèle de mon diplôme qui m'a emmené en thèse immédiatement, ce qui n'était pas une bonne idée en soi, mais qui m'a quand même ouvert au monde de la recherche. J'ai passé 2 ans comme doctorante au LET, justement. Et là, j'ai rencontré des gens qui réfléchissaient aux pratiques, aux nouvelles pratiques. Je me suis retrouvée à faire de la veille documentaire sur les nouvelles pratiques. Donc, ça m'a ouvert tout d'un coup un champ des possibles important. Et puis finalement, j'ai rencontré l'association Didactica qui m'a ouvert les yeux sur le fait qu'on pouvait se positionner en tant qu'architecte ailleurs que dans la sphère de la maîtrise d'œuvre. Et puis finalement, j'avais pas de financement pour ma thèse, et du coup, j'ai fini par me décourager de cette situation d'être obligée d'habiter à Paris sans financement, en n'ayant été pas trop habituée au milieu de la recherche. C'est très difficile, c'était assez violent. Donc j'ai décidé d'abandonner. Et du coup, je me suis retrouvée chez mon papa et ma maman en Mayenne, avec pas de boulot, et j'ai essayé de candidater dans plein d'agences d'archi. J'ai eu des échanges extrêmement intéressants qui duraient parfois des heures avec des gérants d'agences et qui finissaient toujours par dire bah ouais, mais bon, vous allez pas être efficace. Vous sortez de l'école, vous avez fait 2 ans de recherche, donc j'ai carrément quitté les ordinateurs, quitté AutoCAD, quitté Archicad, donc plus personne ne voulait de moi. Et du coup, j'avais ce projet là qui est né là, et j'ai dit je vais m'occuper avec ça, et puis en fait c'est devenu mon métier. Voilà.
Un mal pour un très 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 grand bien, mais est-ce qu'à un moment il y a une frustration de ça, c'est-à-dire que d'un côté, en vous entendant dire que vous avez voulu faire de la recherche, je me dis que peut-être que finalement la maîtrise d'œuvre était pas si évidente que ça à la sortie d'études, mais finalement vous avez postulé dans des agences, donc vous aviez envie tout de même de faire cette maîtrise d'œuvre plus conventionnelle.
Ah oui. C'est un long processus de deuil. Évidemment, de plus dessiner, la frustration, elle existe. Je dirais même qu'elle est quasi quotidienne. Enfin, Mais elle serait, je pense, pire dans l'autre sens, en fait. Si j'étais en train de dessiner tous les jours et que j'avais pas le temps de rencontrer les gens, donc, enfin, je sais pas, dans tous les métiers, dans toutes les voies qu'on choisit, je pense qu'on justement, on jauge la frustration, puis on va là où elle est la moins pire.
Vous n'avez pas l'air très malheureuse non plus dans votre pratique actuelle. Merci beaucoup, Bénédicte Maillet. Je me tourne une dernière fois vers le public, peut-être, voilà, si on a envie d'une petite question de complément ou un témoignage pour clore nos discussions. Et vous remarquez que j'insiste pas trop parce qu'effectivement, il est l'heure de terminer notre table ronde. Peut-être un dernier mot de conclusion. Je crois que Marjane Essamfar voulait dire un mot. Peut-être Amina Selali. Je vous vois écrire plusieurs notes aussi. Non, je sais pas si... Voilà, vous... Marjane.
La conclusion, mais on a très peu parlé de la maîtrise d'œuvre. On en a parlé plutôt même comme quelque chose de... C'est pas bien...
C'est tellement évident que c'est vrai qu'on a parlé de tout le reste. Mais,
voilà.
mais parlons de maîtrise d'œuvre, vous avez tout à fait raison.
Aujourd'hui, on était réunis aussi pour parler de la diversité du métier, mais n'oublions pas que c'est un très beau métier aussi que d'être architecte maître d'œuvre. Et que ce qui est intéressant, c'est de savoir que l'architecte maître d'œuvre n'est pas là que pour construire un bâtiment. Et c'est ça qu'il faut aujourd'hui remettre sur la table, c'est-à-dire que avoir un tronc commun qui fasse que l'architecte, quand il sort de l'école, moi j'aimerais bien qu'il puisse aussi faire de l'urbanisme que du bâtiment. C'est-à-dire qu'on n'ait pas à faire un choix très tôt dans son cursus et qu'on maîtrise le sujet de la ville. On maîtrise le sujet des acteurs à qui on a affaire en sortant de l'école. Et ça, un maître d'œuvre doit aussi savoir le faire, mais celui qui veut faire de l'urbanisme doit aussi maîtriser ce que c'est que la construction, pour qu'on parle la même langue et qu'on porte toute la société vers le haut.
Merci beaucoup, Marjane Essamfar, de le repréciser effectivement. Un mot, dites-nous, Céline Guichard.
Je voulais préciser pour le concours d'AUE, il faut justement avoir l'habilitation à la maîtrise d'œuvre. Voilà, oui. J'avais oublié de le préciser.
Oui, bien sûr, donc c'est les fameux, donc le master plus l'année supplémentaire. Je vous ai parlé tout à l'heure de ressources pour aller plus loin dans nos discussions. Je conseille absolument ce livre, mais pas forcément pour aller plus loin dans la discussion, parce que c'est pas un livre pour s'orienter dans les études d'architecture, les architectes au défi de la ville néolibérale de Véronique Biot, mais c'est un livre qui raconte de façon tout à fait actuelle ce qu'est l'architecture et quelles sont les pratiques de l'architecture, et c'est voilà, très documenté et très intéressant. Véronique Biot, vous aviez une autre ressource qui, celle-ci, pour le coup, peut aller peut-être plus en prolongement de nos échanges.
Je voulais mentionner le fait que l'ONICEP et la plateforme publique France Université Numérique, FUN, ont demandé à ma collègue Élise Macaire et à moi-même de réaliser un MOOC qui s'appelle « S'engager dans l'architecture de notre cadre de vie » et qui est composé de 23 vidéos courtes qui présentent pour partie les études en architecture et pour partie les métiers de l'architecture pour le grand public, essentiellement les lycéens se destinant aux études d'architecture. Donc je vous conseille de vous inscrire à FunMOOC et de visionner ce MOOC. Ça peut se faire de manière totalement libre, dans l'ordre que l'on veut. Ce n'est pas un MOOC au sens d'une sanction ou d'une certification. Il s'appelle « S'engager dans l'architecture de notre cadre de vie » sur FunMOOC. F-U-N, s'engager dans l'architecture de notre cadre de vie.
S'engager dans l'architecture de notre cadre de vie et FunMOOC, F-U-N. C'est pas mal comme nom, FunMOOC. Très bien. Et ben voilà, on va faire un petit changement de plateau. On va se retrouver dans 10 minutes pour la table ronde suivante. En tout cas, pour clore celle-ci, je voulais remercier vivement nos invités Véronique Biot, Marjane Essamfar, Bénédicte Maillet, Amina Selali et Céline Guichard. Et je vous remercie à tous de nous avoir suivis et pour vos interventions. À tout à l'heure.
Digital sector, because you're faced with very, very powerful platforms. And today you have problems like buyouts, which we will mention later. This, in fact, will probably be the overall challenge we are faced with. Then the second challenge was the pandemic, which put the sector to an end, to a stop, because especially as far as the musical and performing arts sectors are concerned, where people could no longer perform, no longer the copyrights, royalties, because in fact, the bars, restaurants were closed, so no music was played. So it was the AIDS and system which enabled artists to survive that period. Now, the transposition of the directive is still a priority. You have some 17 member states, 14 member states which have not transposed Article 17. You know that you have new agreements between authors' rights organizations and companies. It's essential that all of the member states transpose Article 10, Article 17 rather. So, thank you. Pudding, what about the challenges faced by the audiovisual sector? I'm sure you're facing the same challenges. We've heard they need to face up to the emergence of new distribution formats, new players, especially in the digital sector, new platforms. I imagine for the audiovisual sector, this is also a challenge, right?
Ça marche pas. Voilà, merci. Oui, c'est mieux.
Celui-ci fonctionne.
Pour nous.
Well, let's say that we are dealing with similar issues, but the most significant challenges for us was, in fact, the pandemics. As Veronique put it, for us in the audiovisual sector, it meant that anything had to be interrupted, including the actual filmmaking for freelance workers. You can imagine that it was extremely difficult. It had an immediate impact on both production and distribution, in particular in the cinema halls. And in terms of European intervention, well, in fact, the transposition of 2 legal texts has been slowed down, the purpose of which was to somehow preserve the way the European audiovisual sector was working. So everything had been postponed, and we found ourselves in a rather complex situation. You have the author's right evolving, and also the ability of our, the distributors to actually make use or exploit these works. And the SMA audiovisual sector directive, in fact, has been also evolving. And this was impacted with the streamers, and no need for us to mention them because they are so well known. Well, thank you, Pauline, for this overview on the audiovisual sector. And we know that there are plenty of challenges and various of such challenges. So we know that in that sector, people tend to work without any safety net or limited safety nets. They are support measures, support schemes that are put in place, but we tend to forget that in countries like, let's say, Malta, Slovakia, it's not necessarily the same type of support they're receiving. So once again, plenty of challenges, plenty of hindrances, obstacles, and yet you remain optimistic. So this optimism actually is reflected in the conclusion of the French presidency. In the previous panel, well, for those who stayed, I'm sorry, but I might be repeating myself, but it's important, I think, to understand how all of that works before we dig into the details of those conclusions, I mean, presidency conclusion. You need to understand the institutional framework to really understand what EU presidency is all about and what the conclusions actually mean. So it's not just a country waving its flags and saying that I'm holding the presidency. Let's say that first of all, the presidency of the EU, how shall I illustrate that? Well, it's not acting as a guide. In fact, you actually accompany the process. Every 6 months, a country takes the lead. And within the Council of the 27 member states, to give the impulse, the trigger for the different texts that are being negotiated, and to make sure that this is leads to fruition. And they also, I mean, the country is also expected to tell about the future impetus. And so they would have to extract from the overall system to actually get everybody, I mean, among the 7 member states, to agree on a target. Well, in certain cases, they just agree on the minimum. But over the past 6 months, under the French presidency, so as you know, playing the role of a conductor, if you like, or the lead, they tried to reach a number of conclusions, and those conclusions, in fact, covered a whole range of subjects. But today, we're going to focus on 3 of them, if you allow me. I shall try to summarize, and I need to summarize because otherwise we won't have time. And the 3 items I would like to refer to include those that are linked to acquisition threats, that in fact the risk of being taken over by foreign companies, and the EU is trying to protect the industry. And there comes the author's rights, or the copyright. And I think that this is a subject which is going to be quite difficult. That is known as the discoverability. That's the way they put it in English. Découvrabilité in French. So it's up to you experts to explain what all of that is hiding. But so this is one of the other priorities which we shall try to deal with as comprehensively as possible. And of course, we expect to hear you, panel members, I mean, how your vision is in terms of how it's going to evolve in the next months. So in other words, whether these different orientations are likely to bear fruit. So that's, I think, it is time for me to turn to the panel members. So, in terms of the acquisition fraud, the competition from the outside, is there any volunteer to start? Who's going to start first? Who's going to be daring enough to start? Just as you like it. Pauline, go ahead. Well, I don't know exactly where to start from. The real issue is what's at stake. Why are we suddenly worried about this? In the past, we were not so much aware or conscious of the fact that we're likely to lose something. In the audiovisual sector, that's the issue of the intellectual property rights evolving very quickly. on a day-to-day basis, would it be in license contracts or other types of contracts for distributing the cultural goods? Well, there is the potential of losing the rights, of works that have been produced in Europe by European players. So we need to be clear about the reality of that threat. For us, it's a real threat. We have to deal with that on a day-to-day basis within the framework of drafting the contracts. And it is important to come up with the relevant measures to protect ourselves, and that's where the EU and member states need to intervene to help us protect us. This can take different forms. In France, for example, if I remember well, there is a text that deals with the strategic audiovisual assets. So sort of a catalogue of the rights and the extent to which those can be transferred to non-European players. So if this issue of the rights is not secured, we might end up non-European players producing in Europe, and they will generate on the basis of the work done by the European states. And by the way, it's so difficult to define. So it's in fact the value of the creation would be outsourced, externalized, if you like. And this then would raise the issue of the long-term survival of the authors. So the artistic and control of their work, and then the copyrights. That is very important for the freelance workers to be able to continue to live and continue to create. And then there are also the rights linked to the remaining catalog, so that the producers can continue to invest in future creations. Well, this is similar to what Veronique referred to. Well, it's not really a buyout, it's a buyout. What it actually means is that non-European economic players would resort to, I would say, aggressive. Yes, normally it can be aggressive when two entities contracting, one is so big and the other so small, so it can be highly aggressive. So how the Commission tries to deal with this issue? Well, the buyout issue is something which is quite frequent in the audiovisual sector. The filmmakers and other players, in fact, tends to be somehow impoverished, if I may put it this way, by the bigger players. In the audiovisual sector, the idea is to actually jointly manage their rights, and this is what helped them to face giant players, generally based on in the US, video on demand platforms who act based on the American legislation and forcing somehow the authors to sign take it or leave it type of contracts, take it or leave it. So they would have a sort of a flat amount, and then even though your piece of work is extremely successful, you would have to sign once and all. So you produce your music, you're being bought out, in fact, of your own work. So it can be, there are different types of buyouts. It can be for a given period of time, it can be forever. In any case, let's say the balance of powers between the a large player and a small power is such that it's aggressive. Normally, the platform had to go through the collective association. So, but they circumvent the European model by importing, so to speak, the American legislation into a contract they sign directly with the offer. So that's the reason why it is important. And by the way, I'd like to pay tribute to the French presidency for what they have been doing. So, based on submissions made by member states, the conclusions of the presidency is that it's a broad issue, which is developing across Europe, and therefore it has to be dealt with at European level. So the European Commissioner Thierry Breton a few days ago at the European Parliament said, well, congratulations to France for that, and we are going to focus on that in the months to come. So the issue is on the table, if I may put it this way. It's a matter of having a collective approach. It's a matter of a balance of power. We need to act collectively in order to defend our model. I did refer to the artificial intelligence, to the metaverse, and we need to make sure that our model, European model, is at the core of all this process. It's very important for our cultural diversity, and we need to act on time. What about publishing? Are you facing similar problems? And if not, did the French conclusions, in fact, give you some inspiration? Well, the buyout, well, I say that's not part of the practices. Having said this, well, the type of relationship which you can have with distributors, well, we can, in fact, face, in fact, small, let's say, misuses. So gradually, the partner or the small player would have to accept gradually what is imposed by the larger player. So, well, of course, in the French presidency's conclusions, so there are plenty of things which are quite inspiring, and maybe not in the buyout, but what is known as the discoverability issue. Well, that's very important. And here again, we have to make sure that we do not are, let's say, overwhelmed by non-European legislation. So it's to avoid things being or coming outside Europe in terms of legislation. Federico? Well, let's say that this is an issue which is specific to the audiovisual sector, so therefore I'm not too well on the buyout issue. Having said this, you have the concept which you refer to as discoverability. It is important to always recognize the role of the producer. What's the producer's role? The producer takes some risks. There is always some risks there. And the contractual freedom is the pillar. It's the process whereby this risk-taking is recognized for the producer. This is referred to by the directive, and that aspect is or has to be the counterpart in these discussions. With regard to the European dimension versus the rest of the world, and particularly the US, it is important, at least in the field of music, to consider the following. First of all, our largest member organizations well, let's say, let me put it things differently. In fact, European production has never been so strong compared to what happened over the past 20 years, whether it be France, Italy, Latin countries, but also other countries. Most top 20s are in fact our local, let's say, producers and in local languages. So, and this without any legislative intervention. It's just because the content is so attractive for the users, for the listeners, and they are just successful without having to resort to legislation. Now, while we should never forget, however, that even with just contractual freedom, you can be successful. We can act in such a way that the European cultural production be successful without legislative intervention. Well, that's for recorded music, but I think that for the audiovisual sector, things might be different. Pauline? Yes, in fact, we have diverse sectors that are not facing the same types of difficulties. In the audiovisual sector, facts are different. First of all, we have a legal framework which defines the national intervention to ensure that this sector works properly. You have to bear in mind that across the EU, not all countries have the same production capability. On that issue of a legal framework to protect local production, you have to take into account the need for cultural diversity within Europe. We need to have people able to create in the audiovisual sector, even in the smaller European countries. Well, of course, it might be more or less difficult, more or less expensive, and there is also the leeway. You need to be able to, of course, have an audience, and it has to pay off for those people who created, for them to be able to continue to create. Now, we, as I said, we have the audiovisual sector directive, which serves as a frame, and public money can be can contribute in order to support us. And there are new formats, like the serials segments have been developing across Europe, and they are actually successful. It did create a significant impetus in terms of attracting larger audiences. But then, are all of that done in such a way that the offers can survive in the long term? Does it allow for freedom of creation? I mean, diverse creation? Well, nothing. Nobody is opposed to entertainment. In fact, it's important to come up with pieces of work that are attracting people. And audiovisual work plays a role beyond just entertainment. It's like the mirror of the society. The societal dimension of audiovisual creation is very important, in particular in the area of cinema. And we would like, in our community, to see that continue, even though we are also happy to see that the audiovisual production is booming, so to speak. And the next question is the sustainability of this process. If you produce so much entertainment and you invest a lot, and then somehow you pollute also. So what about our social responsibility in that process. So we shall come back to that later because it's a key issue. But for the time being, let's finish with that a bit of our conversation. And I think that we can now talk about what is known as discoverability and what is at stake. It's one of the key conclusions in the French presidency that's comparatively new. It's sort of an innovative public policy approach. So, and you were saying that in the publishing sector, it's an issue. Well, we just to give you an example, each year about 500,000 new books are published, and you, of course, you need to attract the audience, readership to these books. And one of the dimensions with regard to cultural diversity is the following. Let's consider the pandemics. During the pandemics, people were some had to stay at home. They started buying books, and in our sector, people did buy plenty of books. However, most of them bought books via online platforms like Amazon, and they tended to buy bestsellers, and so therefore the small, let's say, authors are not impacted by this boom. So if you then turn to the library, the small library, you can walk around, and the person might actually be able to give you an advice and not just let you buy what the largest, the most successful books or the most known books. Well, Ludovic has been working on that, I think. The challenge of which the emerging artists have been facing, the heritage catalogue has been very much highlighted. People started to rediscover the Beatles or songs by Patricia Cass. So the lockdown period has been very complicated for the small authors. And now concerts are back, and traditionally that's a way for emerging artists to get to be known when they come to the marketplace. And then today there is a sort of, I would say, large, excessive number of small players, and therefore it's more and more difficult for the small players to make room for themselves in this area.
Now the theater operator, owners, etc., are going to have to once again be active, to put the names of people on the billboards to see who's coming. Now, as far as the authors are concerned, and here I agree with what was said, the pandemic, the lockdown has pushed people towards the digital uses, which has given opportunities to VOD, musical streaming, etc. That's great, but is this sustainable over time? Can we continue with such modes? For the VOD, there's the problem of buyouts, and with the musical streaming, there's a real problem in terms of copyright and royalties. When you look at the thousands of people on Spotify, you have 7 million people, 7 million offers on streaming. And this is thanks to the collective management, which offer large access to the repertoire. Yet you have only a few authors benefiting from this. Why? Well, for several reasons. Access, or the discoverability is the challenge. The homepage of these platforms, the playlists, all of the things that play an important role in prescription, to try to guide people in the works they read or listen to. Well, here there's a real problem with regards to the transparency of algorithms. And here maybe we need legislation and intervention. Maybe we should try to promote European works. This exists in the audiovisual sector, but what about music? These are questions we might ask. Do we need to promote a certain repertoire so that the more niche type of repertoire will have access to their public? There's a study that's going to come out end of September on the question of streaming and what our prospects are on this market, which offers great potential, but which gives almost 0% royalties to their authors. So this is a market which is really flourishing. Two key questions here, I think. Véronique, the value gap, as it's called, which is in fact the value transfer, in fact, the transfer of value. So let's speak in French, so the value gap. Here we can talk about the fairness of the remuneration of these online models, which is nothing like what you get in the performing arts sector, of course. But, it's not the same as with the old times, with records and where the artist was remunerated. And this is especially a problem for the emerging artists. So this is a real challenge. We spoke of Article 17, and I think that it's a bit linked to this subject, in fact. Are there other challenges with regards to the transposition of the text? Let me remind you that a directive is a European law which does not apply when it's voted. It's not going to come into force. For a directive, each member state has to look at the text of a directive, look at its own national law, and then try to fit the directive into its legislative framework. So it means that it's a text which, to a certain extent, has to be adapted to national law, maybe be the subject of a bit of interpretation, which has to be as true to the original text as possible. Otherwise, the European Court of Justice will say it's not a true transposition. So I hope that this is all right for everyone. Now, as far as this question is concerned, I have a comment to make that I'll repeat. You should not, describe the situation of music and the European repertoire as being negative, because we have data. We see that the new types of music, the new artists have a great deal of success. There's a real generational change in the European music landscape, which is exceptional. And this is why you need to be aware of it. Now, as far as the the value gap is concerned, you need to note that the Europeans' decision is historical, because for the first time, an international body has said that the platforms are responsible for the content, for the content they transmit. For us, who have been in Brussels for 15 years, it's something that would not have been envisageable 10 years ago. It's a veritable revolution. Now, it might seem evident, obvious, but it wasn't. What do you have to do if you're a responsible member? You need to get a license. For us, in the music sector, it's essential they take a license. We are not in a situation where we're trying to prevent people access to content. No, we want the content to be as available as possible on the greatest number of platforms possible. So our objective at the legal level is to have an environment where we can give licenses to everyone, and this on a contractual negotiation base. This, in our opinion, is the best system to ensure that the artists, the entire chain, be remunerated. The more licenses, the more the artists, producers, etc., will be remunerated. So in Article 17, this is what we are looking at. So this is what Article 17 is all about. Yes, it's essential, and it was very clear. The challenges here are quite revolutionary, especially when we look back 10, 12 years ago, where we've totally changed paradigms here. We've changed our vision of things, and this is a real step forward for the creators, artists, for the right holders. Even if not everyone has the same rights. I'd like to come a little bit back to Article 17. As Ludovico was saying, as far as music is concerned, you need to consider Article 17 as a text with two aspects. One, which concerns the licensing, etc., for certain sectors like music. For the book, this is not the case. It's economically unmanageable. We tried to estimate what YouTube should remunerate us. Well, it didn't work. It would have to, YouTube would have to pay 500 times what they pay in music to have something which would be viable, So it's not something that is good for all sectors. So for us, Article 17 in the book sector, it's that we be protected. We be protected from these platforms. So the other aspect of Article 17, which is extremely important for us in the book, by protecting our rights, by protecting us so that our, in fact, not be present. This is one of the challenges of the PSA. This is the protection of authors' rights. The DSA, excuse me. The DSA is a regulation, not a directive. Regulation, a European regulation, is one whereby the member states have little possibility of transposing. A regulation is directly in place and enforced. Remember that all of the texts are negotiated by the member states in Brussels. It's not anything that's imposed on Brussels, by Brussels, which falls out of the sky. We get the impression that the general in Brussels is forcing things on the member states. No, it is the member states. It is the member states, in fact, who negotiate and discuss these subjects in Brussels. And let me remind you that as far as this subject is concerned, France has played an important role in imposing its wishes. So, in fact, for the regulation, the slogan that was used before the DSA was that what is illegal online is illegal on a book. So this is to protect authors' rights from illegal content. And you have all of the procedures explaining how you can fight illegal content. If you are a bit naive and look at things from outside, what do we mean by illegal content? To come back to Article 17. We're going back to Article 17 where you asked the question and you didn't give me a chance to answer. All right, so we keep illegal content in mind. For Article 17, what's important was to make the large platforms which use the data used by the consumers on their platforms online. They were saying they were not responsible because they were not posting the content on internet. And so this leads us to differences between Spotify and YouTube. Spotify puts content online themselves, so they have to ask for this right to do so, authorization, before they do so. Whereas YouTube was saying it was just an intermediary. Thanks to Article 17, they keep their intermediary status, but they are responsible for authors' rights, etc. And they lobbied over several years, physically threatening the European members of Parliament. They made the world think it was the end of the internet, that the challenges to freedom and freedom of expression were going to be called into question. And today, everything's fine. The European Court of Justice has confirmed there is no threat. So the various organizations representing authors have negotiated with Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, etc., for this income, which they did not have in the past. And this is important. That concludes the chapter on Article 17, which is complicated, but which changes so much, and which has led to legal protection for the authors' rights and their and related rights. So to talk about this richness, we need to talk about the fight against illegal content. So you have this, if I'm a YouTuber, an amateur YouTuber, and I join this game that is YouTube. If I decide I really like a song and I want to use it as background music for my tutorial on spaghetti with ragu sauce. Now, what happens? What am I supposed to do? If I use a song by Clara Luciani without asking anyone for the authorization to do so, so it's YouTube. YouTube is going to notify me that I have to remove the song? Or, I mean, how is it going to work? What about me who, put this on YouTube? What about? It's very simple. There's a license. It's a case which is not going to be a real case because normally we go to Twitter, YouTube, and we offer them a license. If they decide not to take the license, then they are responsible for the infringement of the rights. The objective, though, is to have them get a license. The problem is solved at the basis by this agreement. So YouTube is going to inform them? No. YouTube is going to pay for your use. Your use is not free of charge. There's traffic, they use your data. There's an economic model underlying YouTube. Yeah, that's what Veronique was explaining. That's the whole thing. We found ourselves in a situation whereby, and Veronique was right to say there's a difference. between the DSPs and the user applauded platforms when they say we are passive, we're not responsive. But at the same time, they make a lot of money on the activities of the users, where you have, all of this all the legislation regarding the protection of private data, etc. So today, you have protection for the data, personal data, the European regulation on data protection. So this means the platforms now have a business model which is based on the respect of the law. You need to know that before Article 17, everything was accessible on YouTube, but no one was paid. After Article 17, everything is accessible on YouTube, but the authors, producers, etc., are remunerated. To conclude with this point, because once again, it's something that we could spend hours on, Quentin, Bonnie, do you want to add something? I don't have a lot to say because audiovisual works are not commercially used on user-generated content. The audiovisual product is going to either put free of charge on a platform by the right holders. I don't know if you've seen the YouTube Arte CI, where you have a license with a legal framework. It's not just an individual user who has posted this. And when we have such a problem, we confront YouTube for pirating. With the transposition of the Article 17, this is a very, very good step towards fighting piracy by non-right holders. Here, it's not abusive use, it's the theft, then, of content. In the book, do you have anything like that? For the book, we have a status which is close to that of audiovisual sector. Let me give you an example. Someone is going to put the cover of a book online. This has no economic impact on the book in terms of commercial use, but if the book is put online, an audio book, for example, then there the situation is different, and there we can notify you book, etc. That is linked to Article 17. So a new toolbox, which is in the transposition phase, which is changing the rules. And once again, this is a toolbox that France and member states have really insisted upon, especially with regards to the new European model for regulating this. Ludovico, last point on the subject. I must say, I've always stressed the need for licenses, but I think all four of us understand that we must fight this piracy. That's essential if I want to negotiate my licenses. So we all agree the economic model is changing, but we all agree that we need to do more. We spoke about Article 17, we spoke about the DSA, but that is not enough. We need to be ready for the future because piracy is becoming more and more innovative. All of our sectors, in music perhaps more than others, have seen what happened in the year 2000 with internet, Napster, etc. So we are very attentive to what could happen in the future. The legislator is highly attentive to all of this as well. The next Napster, of course, could be right behind the corner. Yes, hiding in the shadows. So it is essential that there be a proactiveness by the user, in fact, that we need to be ready for any new form of content piracy. Now, as far as the future development of the European legislative apparatus is concerned, Pauline, from the audiovisual point of view, what would you like to see implemented at the European level in the 5 coming years? Well, it's quite difficult as far as this is concerned, because our sector is evolving so rapidly. So there are times when we need to understand what we are experiencing in the market, in the relationship between the producer and the author, between the producer and the broadcaster, between the broadcaster and the public, and especially between the worker and the public. Because this is where the transitions come into play. We speak of intellectual property, copyright, piracy. It's all part of the cultural policy, of course. But we need to understand how we can improve the relationship we have with the public online. What about those people who are not going back to the movies? Those who are not going on the international platforms? How are the radio broadcasters model evolving? How do you have online offers which can meet another section of the public? I can't say that I need this or that from the legislator today. What we need is that the existing tools in the present situation, whereby you see a rebalancing between the authors and their contractual counterparts, which are important for us. Then there's the question of the transparency of operating data, which must go from the disseminating platform all the way up to the people I represent. This is something which is extremely important in the directive, because it's going to enable us to better understand who's watching, how he's watching in the future. I often notice that there's a kind of illusion in the audiovisual sector whereby people write scenario and write films with a kind of void. You know, people envisage a story, they turn around, they're going to put it on stage, for example. You know, the audiovisual is focused on the reactions of the public. We've got a lot of studies to prove this. So the whole question of the relationship with the public is something which has the beginnings of a beginnings here of what's happening. And here we have a real question to answer, because contrary to music, as was explained by Ludovico, we have a legal framework with regards to the exposure of European works. Normally you have, whether it's online or other. Now, normally 50% of the broadcasting time must be allocated to European creation. France goes further, you know. So there's this obligation in terms of the time on the antenna, if you like. These platforms have to analyze themselves the content put in front of the public. We're all aware of, you know, how you get content proposed on the basis of what you see. But the question is this platform going to offer you products, programs which you have looked at in the past, similar types of programs, without really proposing new things? So the future regulation, in addition to establishing copyright, etc., What's important is the relationship with the public. How can we raise these questions little by little? How can we raise the issue of the discoverability of the European offer? We know that it's expensive, and we feel that if it's not brought to the public in an active way, they will never be seen. And that's really the nerve of the warfare. How can the European culture continue to be a living, dynamic thing for the public? This is important for the cinema, of course. But if, as a society, we want to continue to be uh, intellectually alive and not just dynamic, it's important we have this. I understand your concern to make available these works and put them on the platform. I think it's one of the priorities of the French presidency, which is a good thing. This is going to perhaps dig a few new things, new itineraries here, perhaps new ways of working at the European level. Time is really flying. We've got about 15 minutes left. Véronique, maybe one last time to answer on this subject, then we'll give the floor for questions. All right, go ahead. I think that as far as the challenges are concerned, I think for the author, the challenge is to be able to work thanks to his artistic work. So we're talking of remuneration in the digital sector. We saw the digital activity has taken on a more important place in our lives because of the pandemic, lockdown. It has changed certain aspects of our life, and we're not going to go back. Article 17, saying that the big platforms can now remunerate, is a good thing, but there's still some problems, especially in the musical streaming, the whole issue of discoverability and access. There's a question regarding the transparency of the algorithms, which might call for a new regulation. This is maybe the time to launch this work project because, we have about 2 years in front of us. Then there will be a change at the level of the Parliament and European Commission. I spoke of the buyout, which is really a subject that's going to have to be solved. These are large platforms which siphon European creativity and do not remunerate the authors. So this is undeniably going to call for regulations and action at the European level. So maybe a text similar to the SMA, the DSA at the level of the musical sector? Is this a question? I think that Ludovico probably will not be sure. No, I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but it is a subject that's going to have to be dealt with. The buyout is something which is important here. There's already in Article 18 of the directive, there is a reference to the question of a proportional remuneration. But this might not be enough in all of the member states, unless all the member states put in place mechanisms which will, in fact, make these contracts non-operative. Now, as far as to doing the same thing as in the audiovisual sector, I don't know. We're going to have to see because I'm not necessarily an interventionist here, but it's true that at the level of European creativity, quite a lot of things are being done. We need to look at the flows, the inequalities, unfairness. Must there be something done so that everyone can benefit from these highly flourishing markets and in this way help the collective management organizations do their work. One last thing here I wanted to mention, and that is that in the music sector, we need to see how things are going to take place. You know, today is not really timely. Well, I think that we need to really fight the unfair aspects here. If you all agree, I look at the different panel members. We're going to give the floor to the public now. I have 2 people who raised their hands. Maybe 3. Yeah, okay. 4. That's 4 questions. It's going to be rather short here. So, I'm going to have a microphone for you.
So, let's make the rules clear. You need to introduce yourself and ask your short answer, and we expect, a short question, and we expect a short answer. Well, I'm going to intervene as an offer. I would like to understand how things work. In the first example of the YouTuber, while showing the, let's say, a recipe with the music in the background, and you're saying that if YouTube has a license for that, there is no problem. So does that mean that YouTube would have to manage all of that collectively, so to really find out what is in fact online, and so that the offer of the music will be paid. I mean, the music which has been used in the background. So the collective management organizations would have to do that. In the second example, if I disseminate or broadcast in my own capacity, I mean, a film which I like, available already in a DVD, and you, if I understood well, you would intervene. So, and if I put online extract of a concert, so this is certainly not allowed. Well, what would happen for those musicians who have been playing during the concert? Well, maybe you can answer on just one of these examples, otherwise we shall spend the whole time on that. Well, for the music, you know, all of that is under the collective management system. If you do that, what you have described, you are covered by the agreement. So between SACEM and YouTube, you can do whatever you want with the music. There is what is known as a moral right, but well, basically, you're entitled, and the offer is going to be remunerated on the basis of what you do with his or her music. Well, in fact, the musicians depend on the producer. And then we have an agreement with YouTube, and it covers all the different types of uses. So it's much more simple than you could expect. Could you use a microphone, please, if you want to be translated? So it's up to the producer and the collective management body to deal with YouTube. Well, in fact, SACEM has been working with YouTube, so there is a license, and it covers all the music, and it's up to SACEM. Well, I'm not saying it's simple. There are YouTube mechanisms in order to monitor the different usages. Do they cover, do they take on board everything? Well, this could be a debate. Does that at least answer part of your answer, of your question? Sorry. So next question. With a microphone. Sorry again, the interpreters can't hear what he's saying. Catherine Elouette, Stefan Hoof, I have just created a platform to make European literature more visible and translate it into French. So my question is this. What do you think about the concentration currently in the publishing sector, but also in other sectors, which for me represents a threat to diversity and to the independence of creation. Well, maybe Quentin is the right person to answer this question on competition and concentration. Well, on concentration, this is not something that we are dealing with at the European level. It's within the remit of the national authorities. Now, what we actually want, as I said at the beginning, is diversity. There are hundreds, thousands of publishers in Europe. What is important then is to make sure that the authors can write what they want to write and have an audience for that. Then coming to the digital issue, whether you have a large number or a small number of publishers, if you have 2 or 3 platforms, in fact, controlling the whole flow, then you end up with the same issues. So, and because they are likely to using algorithms to promote only the popular titles, and that's the real issue. So in fact, competition, that's in fact a matter of regulation, but you have the technological aspect to it. Unfortunately, we can't hear what she's saying without a microphone, so can't translate. So, couldn't hear the question. The answer is, at the national level, deciding whether concentration is an unfair competition, that's something that has to be dealt with first at the national level and potentially at an EU level. But these subjects, as I said, are subjects which we are not dealing with. You did talk about Article 18 and the anti-buyout provisions. So how can we promote this article and make sure that this is properly transposed? Well, in the sector of music, in France, it makes the buyout contracts unlawful, so it's prohibited. It's known as a public order provision. So that's valid in France. In France, it's no longer possible to impose to a composer a contract that would contain, buyout rules. If all member states were to transpose the legislation in the same way, I think most of the problem would have been settled. But the French offers in other European countries, they would still send the same problem. Next question. Please be short. Jean-François Grenier, I am an audiovisual producer. You recognize my accent, meaning that I come from the south of France. Yes, we do recognize your accent. Now, I wanted to just reassert the cultural diversity of Europe. In the Americas, it's not possible to access European content. You would really have to try hard to access European content in the Americas. So what about promoting the European content in these other platforms? So accessibility of European content in Northern America, that's the first question. Second question has to do with diversity. How do you define diversity? Is it language, origin, or the technological systems used? Do you have any observatories or technologies in order to really assess and measure the diversity? So that's a huge question. Pauline, for the first question. It's a disaster, I would say. Yes, it's a disaster. That's another thing I can say. What happened is that When I started working, I was selling films in the international markets, including Canada. At a certain point in time, you can regulate certain things in Europe, but you can't regulate for the rest of the world, in the rest of the world. Unfortunately, content diversity, well, is still to be, tends to be depend on the market, I mean, to the market. And for us, the real obstacle is language. If you use a language, in Estonian, for example, your ability to sell a piece of work in Estonian language would be limited. So the audience at large are tend to be used to have subtitled contents. This is a Game of Thrones, for example. So, people are used to subtitling or so, but things are evolving. We do have, I think, increasingly we do have the possibility of having French works being subtitled also in foreign countries. So, but there is a greater potential than we have ever encountered. So, but how are we going to be able, from a commercial point of view, be able to promote these cultural goods outside Europe? So that's a room, there is a room for public intervention, public financial support, and it can't be regulatory if this is outside the European area of competence. Well, unfortunately, we can't go any further. But very quickly, on the definition of what diversity is all about. What is diversity? I don't know whether we shall open this Pandora box or now or not. Well, let's say that much has to do with transparency. If we have, let's say, greater transparency with regard to algorithm, then we can induce the platforms to be more comprehensive in what they're promoting. So defining what is actually European in music could be very complicated. And the first step, I think, is to have greater transparency in the algorithms used. Well, I think that this is a good start, and it's a good conclusion also for our session. We have covered a lot of ground. I think that our panel members deserve a round of applause. Well, I wish you full success in your conference and enjoy your lunch.